Welcome back, World Warriors, to the penultimate episode of the Street Fighter Retrospective. We're now getting closer to the modern day, which means that it's time to delve into one of the biggest installments of this classic franchise, and we're going to cover every single— Wait a minute! Penultimate? I said this was going to be 6 parts. After I said it was going to be 4 parts. Why is it now 7? How is there that much to say about just Street Fighter V? I mean, Street Fighter IV was a smash hit and Capcom was riding high at this moment. Did Street Fighter V just have that much content, or did something go wrong? Little column A, little column B. Yes, folks, it's time to cover the development of Street Fighter V, and before we begin, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to everyone who has stuck with us throughout all these episodes. And if you have enjoyed these retrospectives and you still haven't subscribed yet, then go ahead and hit that button and ring that bell. I know you probably get tired of every YouTuber out there having to stop to remind everyone to do that, but we're getting real close to 100,000 subscribers, and if you like these retrospectives, I got a special one planned for when we hit that magic number. So if you want to see it, make sure to hit that subscribe and share these videos around, and I thank you in advance. But now, back to Street Fighter V. After the release of Street Fighter IV, Capcom was back in the world of fighting games. Heck, they were dominating fighting games, with Street Fighter once again being a top-selling franchise. Re-releases of their older games now finding brand new audiences. Marvel vs. Capcom was tearing up the tournament scene. But then, something happened.
It's you! Can I help you?
Yeah, Street Fighter Cross Tekken was a huge loss for Capcom. It cost them tons of money to produce and promote, and because of one massive fumble after another, it built up such bad word of mouth that it sold well under expectations. And because of that, Capcom's higher-ups once again lost a lot of faith in their fighting games. Proposed projects were being dropped, budgets were being cut, but even with tensions at Capcom running high, Street Fighter still had the good fortune of being headed up by Yoshinori Ono. The man who had revived this franchise with Street Fighter IV was still there, and he would once again be captaining the ship with Street Fighter V. But here's the thing. Street Fighter IV wasn't made by just Ono. Believe it or not, video games are actually made by lots of people. I mentioned in the last episode that when Seth Killian got to play the early builds of Street Fighter IV, he said that it was in rough shape. But he then spent the next several years working closely with this team to help them get into a more playable state, really helping the team to recapture the easy pick up and play nature that made Street Fighter II such a hit all those years ago. Heck, he contributed so much to the development of Street Fighter IV, the team behind it actually renamed the boss after him as a way to say thank you. Then we also mentioned that Ono's team was having trouble figuring out how to program a fighting game. I mean, it had been a while since anyone at Capcom had any experience with that. So they called up the studio DIMS to handle the actual gameplay. So yes, Ono deserves credit for getting the ball rolling and convincing Capcom to revive Street Fighter, but the actual success of this revival largely falls on many people's shoulders, and not all those people were returning. Development of Street Fighter V began in 2011, pretty much right after Street Fighter IV Arcade Edition was released, and if you remember from the last episode, Seth Killian said that was going to be the final version of Street Fighter IV, so that lines up pretty well. And speaking of Seth Killian, he would leave the company 1 year later in 2012, meaning one of the people who helped to set Street Fighter 4 on the right course would not be here for Street Fighter 5. And in those early years of development, you could tell this game was a bit directionless. There were talks about making this game free to play. At one point, Ono mentioned he wanted to keep the game on the current generation of consoles because he worried about how big the staff would have to be to handle the next generation games. And then they decided to swap the game from Capcom's own MT engine to the much more powerful Unreal engine, which meant that Ono needed to search for a new developer to help them out, someone more familiar with Unreal, and that developer would be Polygon Pictures, which was kind of a weird choice. Don't get me wrong, Polygon Pictures had tons of experience working with Capcom. They did the animated intros and trailers for Street Fighter 4, Marvel vs. Capcom 3, and Street Fighter Cross Tekken, and those videos all look amazing. But I said they did the trailers and intros for the games. I never mentioned anything about actually programming them, and that's because Polygon Pictures wasn't a game developer. They were an animation studio. And hey, they were a damn good one, those trailers look amazing. But why would you now reach out to them to develop your video game? This is all just speculation on my point, but if I had to take a guess, I'd say that either Polygon Pictures reached out to Ono and said they wanted to start developing video games, and since he had good experience with them working on those previous titles, he decided to give them a shot. Or maybe since Capcom was switching to Unreal Engine, Ono didn't really need someone to develop the whole game itself. Just like how Dimps handled the gameplay on the previous title, Ono thought his team at Capcom could do that for this game, so he just needed someone who could make the game look good. And he knew that Polygon Pictures could make some really nice looking cinematics, so why not let them do that for the entire game? Well, together they worked on an early build of Street Fighter V, and it looked like they would be going in some strange new directions with this series. Ryu was going to be bearded and disheveled, having spent the last several years living in the mountains by himself to train. He also had the hole in his chest that we had previously seen in Evil Ryu's design, implying this wasn't a mere design choice, that was an actual canonical injury that was going to stick with Ryu. Bison, on the other hand, had taken on a new robotic body, which feels like a continuation of his plan to use Seth as a new body in the last game. However, after tinkering with these designs for a while, they decided it just didn't feel like Street Fighter. I mean, this series was known for its bright colors and animated designs. Going with this more realistic style just felt out of place. So Ono and his team left Polygon Pictures behind and pretty much scrapped everything they had been working on. Which, hey, that's not that out of the ordinary. Most big games typically have a handful of early builds that end up getting scrapped. Except this early build had been going on for a while. In Matt McMuscle's What Happened video on Street Fighter V, he spoke to a source close to Capcom, who told him that Capcom worked on this early build for 2 years. Okay, I said it's not unusual for a game to scrap an early build. It is unusual to scrap a build that they spent 2 years on. But hey, Capcom is a big studio, they had more than enough money to give Street Fighter V the kind of time it needed. Which brings me to the next problem. Capcom no longer had the money to give Street Fighter V the kind of time it needed. When you think of Capcom, you probably picture this golden empire of video gaming, producing some of the biggest hits and most beloved characters in the history of this medium. But that's because you're picturing Cap God. But shortly after Street Fighter 4's release, Capcom started to mutate and deteriorate, shedding their Cap God status and slowly transforming into Crapcom. Crapcom was the name that many Capcom fans have for the 2010s, when Keiji Inafune's influence on the company was becoming far more apparent. We brought up Inafune in the last episode, and while he was hanging up Capcom, he told that company that all the big money was coming from the West, so they needed to make games that would appeal to a Western audience. At which point it became clear, Inafune didn't know what Western audiences wanted. Sure, there were some hits, but for every Dead Rising, there was a Bionic Commando, Dark Void, DMC. Hell, even Dead Rising itself turned sour after a couple of installments. Inafune set this whole company down the path to ruin, and then just left without any repercussions. This man burned the building down and then walked off without even dirtying his shoes. Don't feel too bad about that though. Years later, Inafune would launch a massively successful Kickstarter for his game Mighty No. 9. And let's just say after that game, Inafune's chickens finally came home to roost.
And make the bad guys cry like an anime fan on prom night.
So yes, Capcom was suffering at this time. We talked about how much money Capcom lost on Street Fighter Cross Tekken, but now that you know the whole picture, you realize that was just another number for the pile at this point. This company was facing one expensive flop after another. So when Ono came to the higher-ups and said, hey, yeah, so we just spent a good chunk of time and money working on this early build for the game, but we decided we didn't like it, so we're just going to start all over again. Capcom then looked at him and said, you're going to what? Start over? With whose money, Ono? So Ono and his team now needed someone that knew how to make a game quickly and for cheap, and knew how to make a Street Fighter game. So they went back to their old pals at DIMS who helped them put together Street Fighter 4 and Street Fighter Cross Tekken. Here's the problem though, DIMS at this time was kinda busy. Capcom approached them at the end of 2013, and at this time, DIMS was already deep in the Street Fighter mines. They were putting together a big balance patch for Street Fighter Cross Tekken to try and address all the problems that game had, and Capcom told them that they now had to take all the assets from Cross Tekken and turn that into Ultra Street Fighter 4. So they were already working on 2 projects when suddenly Ono came strolling in like, hey buddies, who wants to make Street Fighter 5? But DIMS, being a workhorse studio, was not one to turn down a job. So even though they were already being stretched thin, they decided to keep on stretching. However, this brings us to our next problem. I mentioned not everyone would be returning from Street Fighter 4 to Street Fighter 5, and that extended beyond just the fine folks at Capcom. Remember in the last episode, I said that going back to Street Fighter 4, it didn't play like I remembered it. It was noticeably slower and clunkier. But as we moved into Super Street Fighter 4 and Super Street Fighter 4 Arcade Edition, the game got better. It felt like they were getting everything smoothed out. And sure, part of that could have been because they had more time to work on the game and they could learn from the players' responses. But it could also be because, after the initial release of Street Fighter 4, one of the fine employees at DIMS got promoted. Yasuyuki Oda was a developer for SNK in its early days, but when that company collapsed, Takashi Nishiyama started up DIMS and took many of his fellow SNK employees with him, including Oda. He then worked on Street Fighter 4 as a battle designer, meaning he worked on the actual combat itself, but for Super Street Fighter 4, he got promoted to game designer, and then with Arcade Edition, he got promoted to designer, meaning he now had a big say in where the game was going. And if you remember, not only did those 2 installments feel better than the original release, but 3 of the 4 characters added in Arcade Edition were considered some of the most fun characters in the entire game. So yeah, as it went along, Yasuyuki Oda was instrumental for the continued success of Street Fighter 4. But in 2014, when their pachinko endeavors went up in flames, SNK came crawling back to Oda and said, please, we're sorry, we promise we're not going to try and do pachinko games anymore. Just come back, we need a brand new video game and we need it now. And Oda, wanting to help out the company that gave him his start, decided to return to SNK. And from there he revived King of Fighters, Samurai Showdown, and he's about to bring back Fatal Fury as well. Yasuyuki Oda has gone on to become one of the most important figures in the modern age of fighting games, and that is great for SNK. Not very good for Capcom though, because not only was the guy who helped to give Street Fighter 4 its start gone, but now the guy who helped to steer it through its later installments was also gone. Don't get me wrong, there were still tons of other people working on this game, many of whom had been with Capcom for a while, but going through the credits, I was stunned at how many people in high-ranking positions on this game, like designers and directors, got their start with Ultra Street Fighter 4. Like, imagine you get hired by DIMS to come in and work on an update to Street Fighter 4, and they tell you, don't worry, it's just an update, all the groundwork is there. In fact, we're not even really making that much new content, we're just importing a bunch of the characters from Cross Tekken. It'll be a nice, easy first job, just something for you to learn the ropes. Then halfway through that game's development, your boss comes in and goes, hey, so, funny story, we're now making the actual full-blown next game, and it's on a brand new engine that we have no experience with, and it's also going to be made on next-gen consoles, and we're spread so thin that now you have to be a game designer on it. I'm not kidding you. There were 3 game designers listed on Street Fighter V, and 2 of them had Ultra Street Fighter 4 as their first credit. So okay, you now had a stretched and largely inexperienced development team, working on an engine that they didn't know, and a studio that was going flat broke. They needed this game's announcement to blow people away and make them excited. It did not. The game was revealed on December 5th, 2014. Problem is, it was actually supposed to be revealed on December 6th at the Sony PlayStation Experience, but someone at Capcom accidentally published the trailer on YouTube a day early because if there is one constant in this universe, it's that Capcom fighting games will always get leaked early.
So we have been working behind the scenes with Capcom on another secret project that isn't as secret anymore.
But the game was officially revealed on December 6th. And so was a surprise announcement that people weren't expecting. This game would be coming to PC, PlayStation, and that's it. Yes, this would be a PlayStation console exclusive. In an interview with Event Hubs, Capcom's marketing manager Matt Dahlgren said the reason they were going exclusive with PlayStation was because, quote, "we share the same vision for the growth potential in the fighting game space." And then later, Yoshinori Ono would tell Games Radar that they made this exclusive so that way they could have the game be crossplay with PC and, quote, "unify the community." Hey, those are nice thoughts. They're also lies, but they're nice thoughts. Yeah, remember in the last episode when we said that PlayStation got multiple exclusive characters in Cross Tekken because that game was costing so much money and Sony came to Capcom with some extra financial aid? Guess what happened again? Capcom was bleeding cash, and this team had just spent 2 years working on a prototype that they then tossed in the trash. They needed money, so when Sony said, "we'll give you a check as long as you stay away from them Xbox boys," Capcom had no choice but to take it. So okay, you started this announcement off by upselling a solid chunk of your player base, but what about the gameplay reveal? Yeah, just a few days later at the Capcom Cup, there was an on-stage demo between Combo Fiend and Mike Ross, and the game, well, it clearly wasn't ready just yet. Visually speaking, it was unpolished, it definitely needed another pass, but the actual gameplay looked okay. There was some kind of a revenge meter that appeared to give your character a super, but more interestingly, each character seemed to have different levels of EX bars, and you could sacrifice that EX bar to go into some kind of a super state. And there appeared to be some new moves for each character, there were some changes to classic moves and how they worked. It definitely looked intriguing. And just a few weeks later, there was another demonstration held at the Taipei Game Show. However, this demonstration showed off just how far from ready this game was. At one point, Chun-Li went into her brand new super state and proceeded to just spam the ever-loving crap out of her Kokokens. Now don't get me wrong, they did patch this out rather quickly, and this was clearly an early build of the game, and there's always going to be broken stuff in these alpha builds. But this wasn't, oh, if you get them in the corner and you have this exact right kind of setup, and then you have lightning fast reflexes and know exactly how to do this one mechanic in the game, then you can end up doing an infinite. No, this was, hey, if you use the new mechanic in this game, Chun-Li's basic projectile fills up the entire screen. And as I said, it's not unusual for a game to have broken stuff like this early on in development, but typically when they have stuff this broken, they're not showing it off to audiences. That's typically the thing they show off behind the scenes to other Capcom employees. But here, they were forced to show this off to a crowd to try and get people excited. So the fact that they had something this busted in this demonstration, it just screamed to me, we don't have anything ready yet, but we are so behind schedule, we have to just show you whatever we have. And the lead up to release didn't go much better. It was announced that Street Fighter V would be the first Street Fighter to not get an arcade release. And sure, okay, we all know that arcades, even in Japan, are not what they used to be. They don't have those big audiences anymore. But this still felt like the end to an era. An end that was being artificially created by Capcom. Yeah, Ono said that they weren't making an arcade release because Capcom wanted to focus on other styles of arcade cabinets. Translation, pachinko. Yeah, Capcom didn't fall for the pachinko siren as much as some other developers did, but they were still so desperate for money, they had to choose Street Fighter V arcade cabinets or barely legal form of gambling. So now without these arcade cabinets, that meant the first exposure many players would get to this game would come from the open beta in July of 2015. This open beta was being held largely to test out how the game would play online. And that online was so bad, Capcom actually had to close the beta early because it was practically unplayable. So the build up to Street Fighter V's launch was not going well. But hey, it was still Street Fighter. It was still one of the biggest staples of the fighting game genre, nay, of the entire video game world. And Street Fighter IV had left players with so much goodwill that no matter how many weird demos or busted betas it had, people still had faith in this game. And that faith was about to be rattled because on February 15th, 2016, Street Fighter V would release. But not to a cheer, instead to a collective, what? Where do I even begin with this one? Folks, I'll be honest with you, this is the game I've been dreading returning to the most for this retrospective, because to call Street Fighter V the most controversial installment in the series would be an understatement. Not worst, no, I didn't say it's the worst installment. I said controversial, because Street Fighter V for many players was their most hated Street Fighter. But to other people, it was their favorite. Yeah, I know it's easy to dogpile on this game, but I have to make it clear. There are many people out there that like Street Fighter V. Heck, I know multiple people who say they think it's the best in the series. And while I do not agree with them, I can understand where they're coming from. And I can also understand the people who flat out hate this game, so there's a lot to unpack here. I know that normally I start by talking about the gameplay, but yeah, I'm gonna need a minute to unpack that, so instead, let's begin by looking at this new roster. There were 16 characters in total in this starting lineup, a very steep drop from the 25 characters in Street Fighter IV's home release. And let me just say, I don't think rosters need to keep getting bigger and bigger with each installment. That places an insane strain on the developers. Thinking about all the new mechanics and moves and the graphical overhauls that go into every brand new game, saying that you also think the roster needs to keep getting bigger in every single game is just unrealistic. Eventually, you have to make the roster smaller. However, dropping from 25 to 16 meant you could pay $60 for this base game, then $30 for the first season of DLC, and you would still have 3 characters less than what Street Fighter IV launched with. That is a huge drop. And I know a lot of people will defend this size by saying, well, Street Fighter IV only had 25 characters when it came to the home consoles. When it first launched in arcades, it also had 16 characters. But honestly, that's not really a great argument for a couple of reasons. One is, yes, 25 is how many characters the game had on the home release of Street Fighter IV, but not on its initial release. But you have to compare not just initial release to initial release, you also have to compare format to format. And if the home release of Street Fighter IV that people paid full price for had 25 characters, that's what everyone is going to compare this home release to. Secondly, you have to look at the rest of the fighting game world and realize Street Fighter has competitors. It's got other games it will be compared to, and Mortal Kombat and Tekken were both eating Street Fighter's lunch when it came to their base rosters. And the third reason it's unfair to compare this game's release roster to the arcade version of Street Fighter IV is because the arcade version of Street Fighter IV did not have 16 characters. Akuma was a secret unlockable character in the arcade port, meaning there were actually 17 playable characters, not to mention Gouken and Seth, who were completely original boss characters. So you could, and I will, argue it had 19 characters. So yes, the roster of the home release of Street Fighter V was in fact smaller than the arcade port of Street Fighter IV. But as for the roster itself, it's actually not bad. Not great, but there's some solid staples and some really interesting surprises. There was Ryu, Ken, and Chun-Li, obviously the three most iconic characters in the series. Then there's Zangief, Dhalsim, and Cammy, another three classics. Then M. Bison and Vega, two more staples, no Balrog, but not the first time Vega was included without Balrog. But then you got four more returning characters who were big surprises. First was Armika, great choice, huge fan favorite character who hadn't been around for a while, and after Capcom yanked that football away from fans in the last game with the DiCaprio reveal, yeah, this was a welcome addition. Then, shockingly enough, Karin returned. Yes, she was another fan favorite character, but if you remember from our Alpha episode, Capcom didn't fully own this character. She was made for a manga, so the mangaka who created her partly owned her, which led a lot of people to think that she would never return again. But from what I can tell, I think Capcom bought the rights to her, so they now fully own her. And they've been using her all over the place ever since this game. Then, another character from the Alpha games, Birdie returns, although keeping with the theme of changing his appearance in every game, he now looks very different. I'm going to come back to that later. Trust me, it's worth talking about, but not yet, not here, not now. And the final returning character, Charlie Nash. Now, you might be thinking, but didn't he die? Yes. So, how did he come back? He didn't! Well, not entirely. Yeah, if the stitches and green skin wasn't a giveaway, Nash has been Frankensteined together into an undead, vengeful zombie. We'll get into that more later when I talk about the story, and oh god, I just realized I have to talk about the story, don't I?
Hey, wait!
Later, we'll save that for later. That's future Thorgy's problem, not now. Ahem. So, those were the returning characters, but there were four brand new fighters, and these new characters, they're kind of all over the place. First up is Rashid. He's the new face of the game. Not exactly the protagonist, but like Abel in the last game, he's the new hero who is important to the plot. Rashid is great. He's my personal favorite new character in this game. His playstyle is super agile, controlling the wind to jump and flip all over the screen. He's so agile, he doesn't even have a dash like other Street Fighter characters. He has a full-blown run animation like he somehow escaped from King of Fighters. He's upbeat and energetic, very carefree, and constantly acts like a cartoon hero for justice. But deep down, he's a big tech nerd who spends way too much time on YouTube. He's the son of a wealthy Middle Eastern family, traveling the world with his butler Azam. Although it's never stated exactly what country he comes from, his stage in this game is set in the United Arab Emirates, but concept art in a later game mentions that he's from Saudi Arabia, but that concept art incorrectly lists other characters' countries of origin, so yeah, nothing has been confirmed. Although speaking of that, according to Tekken's director Kazuhiro Harada, he was the one who suggested Rashid to Yoshinori Ono, telling him that there was a large and rapidly growing fighting game scene in the Middle East, so he told Ono that it would be a good idea to include someone from that region in the next Street Fighter. I can't lie, I find it very funny that the best new character in this game wasn't even suggested by anyone at Capcom. They had to outsource their good character. Next up from Brazil is Laura Matsuda. If that last name sounds familiar, it's because she's the older sister of Sean from Street Fighter 3. Laura is super extroverted and outgoing and wants to prove to the world how good Matsuda Jiu-Jitsu is. Laura is fine. Honestly, I don't have that much to say about her because, well, I don't think there's a whole lot to her. She wants to prove her fighting style is the strongest. Okay, that's nice, but it also describes like 90% of this cast. She's really outgoing, and hey, that's a fun personality trait, but they don't really do a whole lot with it. And beyond that, if you ask people what makes her stand out, most players are just going to say she's hot, which was kind of the theme of Street Fighter V. We'll get into it more later, but this game really leaned heavy into sex appeal to try and sell these characters, and Laura was front and center for that. So I know she has her fans, not trying to badmouth her or anything, but she's just okay to me. Like, I'll be honest with you, whenever I think of the new characters from Street Fighter V, she's the one I always end up forgetting. However, the other two new characters I never forget. But not because they're good. Yeah, these final two characters were the two new villains of the game, and they certainly stand out, but for all the wrong reasons. First up was Fong. He's M. Bison's newest general and is a cruel assassin who specializes in poisons. He was actually hired to kill M. Bison, but when he found out that he was immune to his toxins, he actually started to admire the mad dictator and began to praise him as his new master. He's a very floaty character with lots of poison attacks that slowly eat away at your life, which is a cool idea, but he remains one of the most disliked characters in this franchise. Why is that? Because remember when I said in the last episode that Ono ushered in a goofier era for Street Fighter? Well, Fong is goofy, and not in an endearing way. He's constantly squawking and screeching, and as deadly and dangerous as his backstory makes him, this is his super move. And I'm sorry, but that is Dan Hibiki levels of silly, but when you turn to me and then say this guy is supposed to be this big, sinister, evil villain, yeah, no, I'm sorry, man, but nobody is going to go along with that. And the last new character, Nikali. He was designed to be the new big threat of this game. He even had the Street Fighter V logo on his face. He was meant to be the standout new villain. Meant to being the key word there because as the story goes on, Capcom tossed him in the trash. He's an ancient Aztec creature who is revived every few hundred years, searching to devour strong warriors. Now, a creature that hunts down and devours the power of the strongest fighters on the planet makes a lot of sense for this genre. It feels like Nikali would fit into almost any fighting game. Any fighting game other than Street Fighter. Yeah, Nikali just doesn't feel like he fits in this world. Don't get me wrong, we've gotten magic in this world before. Rose uses soul power, Bison has psycho power, you got characters like Dalsim who always lean into mysticism. Heck, you could even say that Ryu's chi manipulation and Satsui no Hado are magical. But a mythological predator that's centuries old, that feels like a whole other level that this franchise hasn't delved into before. This feels like a character who would be more at home in Mortal Kombat. And as for his execution, it's clear that they wanted him to be a big threat unlike anything we had ever seen before. But he snarls so much he sounds like you're trying to teach your dog how to talk, and he gets jobbed out so fast in the story mode, you'll miss it if you go to get popcorn. Yeah, he's the character who had a ton of potential, but they dropped the ball with him at almost every single turn. So that's your roster, and as I said, it's not bad. There are some interesting returning choices, but as for the new characters, Rashid is a really big hit for me. Laura has her fans, but then there is a steep drop-off. Well, the characters aren't as important as what you can do with them. So what can you do in Street Fighter V? No, seriously, what can you do in Street Fighter V? Okay, let's talk about this. If there is one thing that Street Fighter V's launch was known for, it was the barren landscape of single-player content. The greatest regret that I have ever had in my content creating career is that I wasn't recording myself live at midnight when I booted up Street Fighter V for the very first time. Because I turned this thing on excited to dive into the newest installment in my favorite fighting game series, went to the arcade mode, and then proceeded to keep searching for the arcade mode for another hour. I even went online and googled how do I find arcade mode in Street Fighter V, until it finally hit me, oh my god, there is no arcade mode in this Street Fighter game. Now these days I'm a very different type of fighting game player. These days whenever I open up a fighting game, the first place I go is training mode to learn all the ins and outs and start trying to find some combos and figuring out what characters I like. And after that I'm probably going to go online. These days, I don't really go into arcade mode until after a few days of trying out all the online features. But back in 2016, I was like the vast majority of people who play fighting games, and I just wanted to play arcade mode. And my stomach sank when I realized it wasn't here. But that's not all. I thought, okay, well, let me at least try to learn these new characters. Let me go into the trials and see what each of them can do. Guess what? This game launched without character trials. If you wanted to learn what these characters did, go into training mode and figure it out yourself. There was zero hand-holding in this game at launch. And then I thought, okay, well, I just want to play against the computer. So I'll just go into versus mode and set player 2 to the computer. You're never going to believe this. No, seriously, it's unbelievable. I'm still hesitant to read these words because I'm convinced I hallucinated this whole thing. At launch, you could not just set the computer as player 2 in versus mode. If you wanted to just do a one-on-one match with your character against a specific other character, you would have to go into training mode and set your sparring partner to fight and just be okay with the fact that you're now playing a single match that never ends. Also, for some reason, if you were doing player versus player on a local match, player 2 didn't have the option to rematch at launch, so if you were at a tournament and you were player 2 and you wanted to play again, you had to verbally confirm to your opponent that you wanted to go again? What? Why? And I want to make sure that I'm getting something across here. This wasn't just a bunch of people saying, oh, I'm disappointed that this thing I like wasn't in this game. No, there was a genuine fear that some audiences were feeling at this. Because remember, this was Street Fighter. This was a series that was known for kind of revolutionizing the fighting game genre. We've already seen it many times in this retrospective, but when Street Fighter decides to go in a direction, a lot of other people decide to follow them. So there were a lot of single-player fighting game fans turning on this game and thinking to themselves, oh god, is this what fighting games are now? Is this like all they're going to be? Is it just about the online? Is it just about the competitive serious players? Did the heads of all the big fighting game families come together in some secret meeting and they all just decided, alright, we're not doing arcade mode anymore. Everybody agree? Good. Now, I've heard people try to argue for this setup, saying, hey, Capcom never said there would be an arcade mode. You should have paid closer attention. You know what? You're right. Technically, they never told you there was going to be an arcade mode. But if I asked you, hey, would you like some water? And then I proceeded to just start pouring it all over your carpet, you probably wouldn't accept, I didn't say there was going to be a glass, as an acceptable response. Well, okay. That's not really a fair comparison. Because that water didn't cost you $60. When every single other game in your entire franchise and about 99% of every single other game within your genre has launched with an arcade mode, call me spoiled all you want, but at that point, I think it's acceptable to expect it. Hell, there have been more Street Fighters with arcade modes than there have been with training modes or online modes, but I'm pretty sure if you took those modes out of the game, you wouldn't come back and say, oh, well, they didn't say anything about I should have paid closer attention. Oh, and also, one more thing. They did say it would be in there. In a phone interview with IGN, it was reported that, quote, Street Fighter will initially feature the kind of standard arcade story mode that you've likely experienced before. You'll go through a series of arcade battles with a small amount of backstory for each character. So they called it an arcade mode. But there was no arcade mode. So what the heck was Capcom talking about in that IGN article? Well, that brings us to the few crumbs of single-player content that was in this game. There was a survival mode, and there was also a story mode. Now, story mode was a series of fights, typically around 2 or 3, where you played through a little chunk of story for each character, not really moving them ahead in any way, more of just establishing where they were and what they were up to. Now, let me just say, if you don't play a lot of single-player content in your fighting games, I get how this might seem like arcade mode to you. It's a series of fights, you get an ending, what more do you want? But I assure you, this ain't arcade mode, and neither is survival mode. In arcade mode, you can go best 2 out of 3 rounds, and it typically starts to get challenging around the 3rd fight. In survival mode, it's 1 round only, and you don't get challenged until like the 20th fight. Meaning it is a mind-numbing grind, hoping that you can finally get to some kind of a challenge, and then if you lose, it's game over. Fight through those 20 mind-numbing battles again before you can get back to this point. Honestly, there is so little content in this game, I would be willing to bet the only reason they kept survival mode in here is because if you beat it, you can unlock colors for your characters. So that way, they could technically brag that this game has unlockables. But as for the story modes, first off, it's only 2 or 3 matches, and they're the exact same fights every single time. So if you want to try challenging someone else with your character, Too bad, it's the exact same matches every single time. And once again, you're only doing one round each. And they also completely fill up your super meter at the very beginning of the match, meaning you start with a massive advantage. You can just unload your super right at the start of the match, and it's already halfway over. Not that you need that advantage, because these are the easiest battles I have ever experienced in a fighting game. The computer is set to the lowest possible difficulty, and there is no way to adjust that. How easy is it? So easy even a baby could beat it. No, that's not hyperbole. There's actually footage of babies beating Street Fighter V story mode. That's why story mode does not count as arcade mode. Yes, it has intros and endings like you would expect in an arcade mode, but arcade modes are a nice, manageable series of fights, not too short but not too long, with a steady increase in difficulty to get you introduced to the fights, but then start challenging you until you find yourself really having to work to overcome some big final challenges. And each time that you play through it, outside the final boss, it's a brand new experience every single time because it has a unique and different lineup of characters. And if you beat arcade mode, you can then go back and raise the difficulty to give yourself an even greater challenge. Story mode in this game ain't that. Story mode in this game is so easy, I actually got bored and tried to see if I could beat it by only hitting heavy kick. Spoiler alert, I can. Also, far more specific complaint about these story modes, but I don't know what was up with this game's AI, but I have never seen a computer that loves to duck as much as this one. Like, it will just sit there crouching the entire time. Did you guys have like an AI program for Guile, but you accidentally programmed that in for everyone? Seriously, if you've never noticed it, you will notice it now. It is constantly crouching. So yeah, not the challenge a lot of single-player fans were looking for. Well, were the story modes interesting at least? Oh, I'm sorry to whoever wrote these. I'm sure you tried your hardest, but no, they're not. Because almost nothing at all happens in these stories. No progress is really made, barely anything gets set up, and in some cases, they're just confusing.
A week's already gone by since we started living together. It seems like she's gotten used to living here, but sometimes she looks so sad that I worry.
Hi, Chun-Li, Thorgy here, longtime player, first-time caller. Quick question. Who is that and what are you talking about? It looks like the girl you rescued at the end of Third Strike, but why is she living with you? What's all this stuff you're referring to? Some of these stories felt like they were referencing things that we hadn't seen yet. Because that's exactly what they were doing. Street Fighter V was supposed to have a full-blown story mode, much like the recently successful Mortal Kombat story mode, which made sense because apparently it was the team at Capcom USA who were really pushing for this. However, because of everything else going on in this game, the story mode had to be delayed and would be installed as a free DLC later on, meaning many of the character story modes were now referencing something not in the game. Now, to say something positive about these story modes, they did feature tons of artwork between each fight from legendary Capcom artist Bingus. Bingus was famous for doing art for some of Capcom's biggest fighting games. He stands up there shoulder to shoulder with some of the other legends like Shinkiro or Akimen. Not that you would know it from going off this game. At this point, I should mention that there was massive backlash to the lack of content at launch, and many representatives at Capcom tried to play it off like, oh, well, that was all according to plan. We always wanted to release this game with limited content, so that way we could continuously build it up and let it grow over time. But I'm sorry, nobody was buying that. We all know the problems this game had during development, we know the bugs you had to fix during the beta, and we know this game had a hard deadline to release and you were struggling to get it out there on time. And you look at this artwork from Bingus, and it becomes clear just how bad it was. Because Bingus is an incredibly talented artist. He's done amazing work for decades now. But the artwork in these story modes just screams rushed. I have no idea how much time he was given to get these pieces done, but it clearly wasn't enough. He had a deadline to meet and about 100 different drawings that he had to pump out. The fact he got them done at all is nothing short of a miracle. And speaking of the artwork, let's talk about the presentation of this game. Now, to start on a positive, I actually really like the music. Most of the return characters once again just get remixes of their existing themes, but I actually think these are some of the best renditions of these songs in the game's history. They're loaded with energy and have a real punch to them. And as for the new character themes, Laura's got a good beat to it, Fong takes a second to get going, but it's really sick when it kicks in. But none of those can compare to Rashid's, which is one of the best fighting game themes of all time. This superheroic anthem is just erupting with energy. This is one of those ultimate gym tracks. You just put this on and you're going to get some work done. When you hear the chorus kick in with that, oh, it is just a shot of momentum right into your veins. It feels amazing. So the soundtrack? No notes, it's great. Can't say the same for the graphics and the art style because dear God, this is the ugliest Street Fighter ever. From the early reveals of the game, there were already people hesitant because, well, it just looked a bit too similar to Street Fighter 4 and I think people were expecting something different. But as time went on and they added some more details, the visual style of the game became apparent. They were going for kind of an oil paint aesthetic, which sounds like a good idea, but they clearly didn't have either the time, the budget, or the know-how to make it work because instead everything looks like it's made of clay. This art style just ruined what probably would have been some solid redesigns. For example, I actually think Ken's concept art looks sick. This is a great new look for Ken. But in the actual game, he looks sick. All anyone could talk about was his worn down, beaten expression that looks like he's been awake for 3 days straight, and of course, the freaking banana hair. That meme was everywhere when this game came out. Although it might actually be a good thing that everyone was so focused on his hair in the front, because then they could ignore that in the back his hair is going straight through his body. There is so much clipping in this game. You are constantly seeing characters' body parts just merging through their clothes. The worst example to me is Birdie's chain going clear through his body because that's not something you have to freeze to catch for one frame in the match. No, that is his pose on the character select screen. It's not like they missed it, it's the first thing you see when you select the character. Right there, front and center. They didn't miss it, they saw it and they said, "We are so far behind schedule. I don't care how it looks. This thing has to go out next week, and we gotta make sure it can at least run." But you know what? Who cares about that? Who cares how the game looks or your silly single-player content? This is a fighting game. It's all about playing online now. This is a brand new era. The online scene is the most important thing in your fighting game. So, how was the online in Street Fighter V?
Oh.
It's so hard to tell what's going on.
Oh my god. Listen, this game is crazy when everyone has a f***ing teleport.
Look at this.
This
my
is
God.
crazy.
Oh my gosh, I'm so scared. I'm terrified. I'm terrified. I don't even know what to do, guys. I'm actually scared as
I believe the technical term for this game's netcode was cheeks, foobar, a smoking crater. Take whatever term you want, it was awful. I mean, it could connect. You could start and finish a match, but it was about as bad as it could be while still being considered functioning. The online in Street Fighter V was like an employee who showed up to work hungover. Yeah, they were there, but you couldn't really rely on it. The online for Street Fighter was so bad, in 2021 during an official Capcom Pro Tour stream, legendary competitive player Punk was asked how he was going to prepare for his match, and he said,
"Nah, I'ma just play Guilty Gear."
You're doing all right in that game, so okay.
Yeah, I'm in Capcom. There's no reason for me to play this game anymore.
Your netcode might be bad, but it will never be pro player tells you to your face in front of a live audience they're going to go and play your competitor bad. And the crazy thing is, Street Fighter V used rollback. And we have been hearing for years that rollback netcode was going to be the savior of online fighting games. It would create smoother, more stable connections that would make online feel almost as good as playing in person. And yet here we had rollback, that actually felt worse than Street Fighter 4's netcode. What happened? Well, 4 years later, a modder by the name of Altimore went digging into the files of the game and within 2 days was able to reverse engineer a solution. They found that the game had a bug in it. This wasn't just some case of they didn't have good online. No, this was a case of they had good online, it was right there, they just didn't install it correctly. And this modder was able to fix this within 2 days, but they concluded by saying that if they had the source code, they could have fixed it in 30 minutes. This was a problem for Capcom for years. Could have been fixed on lunch break. Again, it just screams we didn't have the time or experience to know what we were doing. This is what a rushed release looks like. You release a product so quickly that you install an easy-to-fix bug into the game and you don't even realize it until someone calls you out on it 4 years later. And this had a huge impact on the actual online player base of the game. As I said, the game launched with practically no offline content. If you wanted to play this game, you had to go online. Which again, let's be clear here, was largely thanks to how rushed the game's development was. But on some level, Capcom might also have been banking on this. You see, they knew early on that Street Fighter V was going to take a live service approach, getting players to keep coming back to pay for more updates over and over. Which in all fairness is kind of what Street Fighter had always done. In many ways, Street Fighter invented the live service format with all those updates they kept putting out with new versions of their games. And honestly, as much as I enjoy being able to go back and buy an actual physical version of those older games so that way I can play them in the way that they existed at that time, paying for one season of DLC is way cheaper than paying for a whole new game. However, you can really only get people to keep paying for new characters if they're still actively playing the game. And even though at launch, fighting games will always see tons of casual players, the dedicated online players tend to be the ones sticking with the game years down the road. So maybe, on some level, they hope this lack of single-player content would pick up that casual single-player audience and throw them into the online pool and force them to learn to swim. Well, if that was the strategy, it failed. On the PlayStation, there is a trophy for winning one ranked match. That's it, just one ranked match. And at the time of this recording, that trophy has a completion rate of 8.4%. Not even 1/10 of the players got the most basic online trophy. Over 90% of the people who bought Street Fighter V saw the main feature of this game was going online, and they said, nah, that's okay, I'd rather just accept the fact that I wasted $60. Listen, to any fighting game developers out there who might actually be watching this, if you want to get people to check out your online modes for your games, well, first you need to make the online actually function, that's number one, write that down. But secondly, as counterintuitive as it might sound, the best way to get the single-player audience to try out your online is to give them lots of good single-player content. If you just take away all the stuff that they like in a game, they're just going to be mad and not play it. But if you give them a lot of single-player content to play, and they have fun with it, then when they eventually go through all that single-player content, they'll find themselves thinking, wow, that was great. Wish there was something else I could do. Well, you know, there was that online mode. Ah, what the heck, I had so much fun with this thing, I'll try that out too. So by removing the single-player content, Street Fighter V didn't throw the single-player audience into the pool where they had to learn to swim. No, they threw them into the parking lot where they proceeded to drive home. But even though I was disappointed by this lack of single-player content, I still enjoyed playing fighting games online. Not as much as I do today, where that's the main thing I do in a game, but Street Fighter IV revived my love of head-to-head battles, and it made me realize how fun online fighting games could be. So I did delve into the online modes and check them out, and yes, my connections were spotty at best. But you know what playing this game online did do for me? It gave me a taste of the combat. And I think it's time we finally talk about that. Each player had 3 stocks for their super meter, and you could use each of these stocks to do EX moves, or you could use all 3 stocks to do your big critical arch super. Alright, pretty similar to Street Fighter 4 there. But there were several small subtle changes, such as chip damage now appeared as blurred out gray health that could be healed back, and you could no longer lose to chip damage. And players had complained for years about the one-frame links in Street Fighter 4, requiring you to be 1/60th of a second precise to pull off some combos. But Street Fighter 5 put a buffer in there, so now you had about 3 frames for any given combo, meaning you had a wider opening to connect your moves together. But the big new mechanic of this game was your V-skill and V-trigger. Every single character had a unique move called a V-skill that they could activate by pressing medium kick and medium punch together. And these moves can range wildly. Some of them are pretty basic, like Cammy just had her old quick spin knuckle as her V-skill. But others got far more creative, like Ryu has a Street Fighter 3 style parry. Rashid has a big flip that can turn to a kick. And Armika pulls out a microphone and just starts smack-talking to power up her next attack. But using your V-skill has another purpose, because using these skills, as well as taking damage, will build up your V-gauge. Now when you have one stock of your V-gauge, you can perform an alpha counter, now called a V-reversal, to get your opponent off of you. But when your V-gauge is filled up, you can activate your V-trigger. Once again, this is a unique ability for every single character, and for a few characters it's an actual attack. But for most characters, it grants them a temporary power-up that enhances several of their moves in various ways. For example, Ryu's Hadouken now has electricity bouncing off of it like it did in Street Fighter 3 and does some extra damage. Chun-Li's basic attacks now all hit in extra time. Armika actually calls in her tag partner Nadeshiko to jump in on the opponent when they're least expecting it. And another cool feature was that when you activate your V-trigger, it stops your attack animation. So if you activate it off of an attack, it essentially resets your character, allowing you to do big, long combos. These V-triggers create variety between the characters and would go on to be the defining mechanic of this entire game. But how did players feel about this combat? Well, I said in part 1 this was going to be a far more personal retrospective because Street Fighter is a series that has meant a lot to me throughout my life. And I know I've been saying a lot of negative stuff about this game so far, but when it comes to the combat of Street Fighter V, this combat left a huge impact on me. And it became more important to developing my skills and knowledge of this genre than possibly any other fighting game I have ever played. Because before Street Fighter V, yeah, I played tons of fighting games, had been playing them ever since I was a kid. Hell, after Street Fighter 4, I even started going to my locals and competing from time to time. But throughout my entire life, I never actually sat down and started learning the nitty-gritty. Stuff like frame data, what was plus and safe, learning about footsies and how to read your opponent and control the neutral. These are all things that every serious fighting game player knows are important. But it wasn't until Street Fighter V that I actually sat down and started thinking about this. Street Fighter V forced me to actually get serious about fighting games, and I spent years watching videos that broke this game down and analyzed every single detail of it. And I did all of that because I was desperately trying to understand why I didn't like this game. Because sure, it would be easy to say I didn't like it because it looked bad and there wasn't an arcade mode, but no, at this point I was learning to look past all that and actually care more about the gameplay itself. And man, I did not like this combat. But I couldn't understand why. I mean, on the basic level, it still kinda resembled Street Fighter 4, and I liked Street Fighter 4, but something about this was different. And the V-skill and V-trigger system were unique moves and power-ups for every single character. That's just like the drive and overdrive system in BlazBlue, and I love the drive system in BlazBlue. It was one of my favorite things about those games. So why didn't I like it in this game? There was just something about this combat that rubbed me the wrong way, and I wasn't the only one. This combat was largely criticized for years, but not by everyone. Remember, I said this game was controversial because yes, a lot of people did not like how this game played, but other people loved it. And after spending years digging into this combat, yeah, I can understand why some people feel that way. So let's see if I can somehow describe the problems with this combat while also capturing what people enjoyed about it. For starters, and probably most simply, the timing of your actions felt just off to me. Several basic moves now took a handful of frames longer, and I remember in Street Fighter 4, I would go into the combo trials and I could get through most of them pretty much with any character. But in Street Fighter 5, well, there were no combo trials, so I couldn't exactly test that. But eventually, they were added into the game, and I was having the hardest time just linking the most basic moves together. Just going from crouching to standing punch felt like I was threading a needle. And that went double for when I went online. I couldn't connect anything, and my response time was so off. And that could totally be a personal thing. We all have our own unique rhythms when it comes to fighting games, so maybe I was just more attuned to the timing of Street Fighter 4. But it could also have been because of the 8 frames of input delay in this game. Yeah, it was discovered that the time between when you input your command and when it actually happened was 8 frames. Wanna know how bad 8 frames of delay is? Comparing that to other fighting games that came out around this time like Killer Instinct, Guilty Gear XR, Mortal Kombat X, or even Ultra Street Fighter 4, those games had around 50 to 60% that input delay. If you want to know more about this, then check out the video that Core 8 Gaming did on this. They go really into detail on this, and it's very educational. I'll link it in the description down below. This input delay became a huge issue for Street Fighter V, especially after producer Koichi Sugiyama said the input delay was intentional. Only for Capcom representative Peter Combo Fiends Rosas to tell Event Hubs in June of 2016, no, that was a misinterpretation. He didn't mean that. This is definitely not intentional. So yeah, throw input delay up there on the pile with the online bug and the glitching textures as another result of having to get this product out the door before it was done. Now, in all fairness, Capcom would eventually address this issue, after about 2 years of it being a problem. And along those same lines, not as big of a problem, but this game always frustrated me because I have never played a game where I accidentally threw out as many supers as I did in this game. I can probably count on my fingers how many times I threw out a super on purpose in these 7 years of playing this game. I kept thinking, damn, am I mashing? I mean, I know I mash, I'll admit that. I was born mashing and I'll die mashing. But this didn't happen in other fighting games. I never ran into this problem before. And I swear I wasn't mashing now. I would go into training mode and focus my hardest on only doing a Hadouken, and the super would still come out. It got to a point where I would throw out EX moves even when I didn't need to, just because I didn't want to get a full super bar, because then I knew that that super would come out by accident. So I just assumed I sucked. And I did, I'm not going to try and deny that. You've all spent the last year seeing my Street Fighter gameplay, you know I suck. Here's my rank in Street Fighter V, I'm not trying to hide that. Like I said, bad. So clearly that was the explanation. I was so bad, I didn't even realize I was doing an input twice. But when researching for this video, after all these years, I finally learned, no, it's not just me. Tons of people are complaining about this, and there's actually a reason for it. You'll all have to forgive me for this, but I spent the better part of a decade gaslighting myself into thinking I was hitting buttons multiple times when I wasn't, so darn it, I'm going to actually explain this. This weird random super issue came as a result of about 3 or 4 different mechanics, each of which are fine on their own, but when you smash them all together, they create some kind of an uncanny chimera that's an affront to nature. For starters, this game uses negative edge, which means it doesn't just register when you hit a button, it also registers when you release the button. For example, you can see me doing a Hadouken when I hit the punch button. But I also fire it out again when I do a quarter circle forward and release the button. Now, negative edge has been in earlier Street Fighters, heck, it was even in Street Fighter 4, and it's a pretty handy technique as you can hold the button down, then do multiple other inputs, then release the button afterwards to quickly follow up that move with another attack. Next up, this game has huge leniency for reading inputs, with many people even saying the game gives you, quote, shortcut inputs. For example, I know it looks like I'm doing a Hadouken by pressing down, down forward, and then forward, but I assure you, rather than rolling the controller from down to forward, I'm actually just flicking it down forward and then up. I'm only doing about half the actual motion. Again, this can be a positive thing because it allows me to do way more attacks than normal. Just flicking the controller in the down forward direction is much faster than having to roll an entire quarter circle forward. And third, the input buffer on this game is pretty big. What that means is that it will read your inputs before it's time to actually input them. Meaning you can input the command for your next move while you're doing another move, then when that move ends, the game will read the move you already input. Now, if you combine all 3 of these together, it does allow you to do moves much quicker. For example, here I am pressing punch, and then as I hit punch, I simply flick the controller forward before I release the punch button, and that causes the punch to be followed up by Hadouken. So instead of hitting punch, quarter circle forward, then punch again, I just hit punch and then flick the controller forward, and then bam, it gets the exact same results, but much faster. As you can imagine, high-level players are able to take advantage of this to set up all kinds of crazy combos much quicker and with fewer inputs. The non-high-level players, the more casual players, instead had a very different experience, where you could do a Hadouken. Then if you press down forward playing to set up another attack, and then you take your finger off the punch button just a frame too late, the game reads that as Hadouken, followed up by a second quarter circle forward and a second punch button, and now your super meter is gone. So yes, I know that was a very long explanation, but for anyone who has spent years wondering why your supers kept randomly firing out, there's your answer. I hope that finally got that demon off your back. So okay, the timing of this game just felt off from the very start, but it was something you could learn to work with, and many players did. And the negative edge in the input buffering was rough for casual players, but the high-level players were able to control it and do some really impressive stuff with it. But here's where we start to get deeper with the problems, because even when looking past those few input issues, the core philosophy of Street Fighter V's combat kinda rubbed a lot of players the wrong way. I've thought about it for a while now, and if I had to describe Street Fighter V's combat, it's very precise. It's a game where you can do a big powerful combo, but only if you have the exact right amount of meter, and only if you have the exact right amount of V-trigger, and only if you get the exact right setup. And I know someone is going to say, yeah, that's how all fighting games are. You can do way more stuff if you have the right resources. You use your meter to set up combo potential that you didn't have before. And you're right, that is how fighting games work. The more resources you have, the more you can do. But the problem with Street Fighter V is, it felt like you could only do anything if you had that exact right setup. The basic combat, everything without your EX moves or without your V-trigger, didn't really feel that good. It felt, well, basic. It felt like the entire combat was lined up to get you to that exact point where you could use all those resources to do that big cool combo. But nothing up until that moment was all that interesting. Again, I know every fighting game lets you do more interesting stuff when you have more meter to burn, but I don't feel like I need to make that point with other fighting games, because most other fighting games try to have combat that still feels fun without ever burning that meter. For example, Guilty Gear can let you burn your meter to do a Roman cancel, resetting your character to do a big crazy combo, but even if you never do a single Roman cancel, the stuff you can do in those games is still nuts. Tekken 8 recently introduced this whole heat system where you get all kinds of new possibilities while you're in it. Sounds a lot like V-trigger, doesn't it? Except I can still do my 10-string and pop opponents all over the screen without ever using heat. But let's actually dissect this gameplay a bit more, because there's a lot to go into with this. For starters, lots of people complained that characters felt more limited than they did in previous games. It felt like a lot of the tools that characters had before were now just gone, or they were locked behind the V-trigger. I heard people say it feels like I'm controlling half a character until I get V-trigger. And yeah, I can kinda understand that. A perfect example of this is Karin. In the alpha game, she had an attack that was a series of hand slaps. Now, she just doesn't have that. Except for when she activates V-trigger. When her V-trigger was activated, she could once again do those hand slaps. But she could only do it about 3 times before V-trigger ran out. And in all fairness, these slaps were better than they were in the alpha games. But here's my question. Rather than getting rid of the move except for 5 seconds per match when it's slightly better than it used to be, why not just make it slightly better than it used to be? I know it sounds like I'm saying just make every character super strong, but I'm not talking about giving her air dashes and insta-kills. I'm saying just take one of the moves that she used to have and just give it a tiny buff rather than getting rid of it. The best way I can describe V-triggers is, and forgive me for going to a different series for this, but you know the Electric Wind God Fist in Tekken? It's one of the best moves in that entire game for any member of the Mishima family. Now imagine if a new Tekken game came out and the Electric Wind God Fist was just gone. Or, probably more accurately, it was still there, but you could no longer combo them together. But there was a meter in the game, and if you spent half the round building it up, then you could activate it. And then you could do the Electric Wind God Fist and you could combo them all together again, and it came out slightly faster than it did before. but you could only use it for one combo. And then it would go back to being how it was throughout the rest of the match. Yeah, I don't think most people would agree that's better. And that kind of became the theme for Street Fighter V throughout its development. I've heard many people describe Street Fighter V as the no fun allowed Street Fighter, and yeah, I can understand why. There was the public test for people who pre-ordered the game, but there were also private tests before that. And with every single one of these tests, characters lost moves. They lost combo potential. It felt like someone on the development team just kept saying, "This is too good, get rid of it." I'm not kidding you, it felt like almost every single character lost something. Something that made them more interesting, something that juiced up their gameplay. And this is just a theory of mine, but I'd almost be willing to bet that because this game was so rushed, they might have had some trouble balancing it, which isn't unusual for a fighting game in its early development. But when they realized how little time they had, they said, "We don't have time to balance this, just start taking out moves. Just start deleting moves until everybody feels even." Then when the game eventually came out, it felt like characters were now locked into very specific routes. I said in our Street Fighter 3 video that one of the most important things for a good fighting game is expression. It's being able to play a character in a way that shows off who you are, your own unique personality. But Street Fighter V felt like every character had that way they were meant to be played. They had that combo they were meant to do. And there wasn't nearly as much room to experiment. Street Fighter V to me became the "why doesn't this work" game, because there were just so many moves that looked like they should connect, but they just didn't.
But that's simply not possible.
Why isn't it possible?
It's just not.
Why not, you stupid bastard?
Now, I'm sure some people are hearing me say all this and thinking, oh, what, you just want every move to combo into every other move? No, I don't. But it would be nice if we got a bit more than what we got in here. I mean, heck, that move there with Ken I was just showing off, I showed it off specifically because in later updates of this game, they went back and patched it so that would actually combo. So even Capcom was looking at this stuff and realizing, wait, what do you mean this doesn't work? It really feels like what combo together was so limited. Like, moves wouldn't work unless you were using the EX version of them, or you had the V trigger activated. Which brings me to my next point. As Street Fighter V's life went on, I kept thinking about the combat. I started to use a term, cool moves budget. Cool moves budget refers to how much you can do in the game with or without your resources, how much do you have to work to get those resources, and were the moves and combos that you could pull off with these resources worth that amount of work that went into getting them. I started to think of the game like this when I kept looking for combos that felt good to me, and I would find one with Ken. But it could only be done when he was in V-Trigger. Outside of V-Trigger, nope, that just didn't work. And again, to repeat myself, I get that's how fighting games work. You go into some kind of a crazy super stage, you should be able to do bigger and crazier things. But this new combo did not feel good enough to be locked behind V-Trigger. It felt like something I should just be able to do in the game normally. Not how you get to play for 5 seconds if you spent the entire match leading up to that one point. Let me compare this to the previous Street Fighters. I mentioned that yes, you could use your EX moves to set up combos that you couldn't do before, and that was true all the way back to Street Fighter 3. But you got multiple bars of super in Street Fighter 3, meaning it was possible to build up more EX moves, or you could use your EX moves and still have meter left to use your super. Street Fighter 5? Nope. Only one bar for supers, so you gotta decide whether or not you want to use that meter for your EX moves or your super. You can't use them for both. And it feels like I should also mention that you only get 3 stocks for your EX moves as compared to 4 in the last game. Or your V-Trigger was something that would build up as you took damage, and you would typically only be able to use it once per match. But the stuff that you could do with your V-Trigger was things like, hey, now Ryu's Hadouken goes a little bit faster and does a little bit extra damage for like 5 seconds. That's nice. But Street Fighter 4 also had a mechanic that you had to build up to and you could only use about once per match, and here's what that looked like. Now, I ask you, which of those two felt better? Sure, the V-Triggers were good, but they weren't good enough for the work that went into them. That cool moves budget is way too low. This is a cool moves budget penny pincher. And sorry for repeating myself again, but I'm aware that people are going to argue, no, those moves are actually really good, because they can set up for this, which then sets up for that. And if you use this one-time buff correctly, then you can do this combo. And you're right, these V-triggers can be great, but only if you use them in the exact right way, with the exact right setup, and you know the exact right combo. Going back to my first point, that Street Fighter V was a very precise game that wanted you to play it in a very precise way, and you could only do that with those precise resources. And that kind of became a theme for Street Fighter V. I'll get more into this later, but it sort of created two different worlds for its audience: the casual player base and the dedicated player base. And the casual players found the V-triggers to just be way too restrictive. They didn't feel good enough. However, the dedicated players also had a problem with the V-triggers because they found them to be too good. Those more experienced, dedicated professional players who knew exactly what they were doing with each character quickly discovered that these V-triggers made some characters just flat out better than others. V-trigger became a comeback mechanic, and I'm fine with comeback mechanics as long as everyone gets one. But some characters got almost nothing off these V-triggers, whereas other characters could now wipe the floor with the opponent as soon as they activated it. And speaking of being divided into two worlds, let's talk about one of the biggest complaints that players have with this game: footsies. Footsies, the ability to control that space between you and your opponent, being able to get your hits in while keeping your opponent out, it's incredibly important to this genre. But when researching opinions on this game, I found so many people saying Street Fighter V has the worst footsies in Street Fighter history. And I also found people saying Street Fighter V is the most footsies intense game in the series. So for anyone who thinks that my coverage of this combat has been all over the place, there's a reason for that. Opinions were all over the place. And after looking into it, I think I understand why, and it's not just because the term footsies is so vague that even the fighting game glossary refers to it as, quote, a complicated, often nebulous term and can mean different things to different people. Gee, I wonder why so many people have trouble understanding fighting game terminology. Street Fighter 4 was criticized for being too defensive focused, so Street Fighter 5 tried to counter that and be more aggressive. Characters had more moves that allowed them to get in on the opponent. Far more attacks were safe and hard to punish, encouraging you to go in. And thanks to things like your V-trigger and crush counters, if you had the resources and the setup you needed, you could go into a massive combo that just decimated the opponent. And as a result, Street Fighter V became a game where if you guessed wrong twice, you could be dead. Partly because each combo could go on for very long, but also because, dear God, the stun mechanic in this game is horrendous. Okay, I'm gonna go on a quick side tangent here for a second because there's no other place that I can fit this in, but it has to be brought up. Stuns have been in Street Fighter since the very beginning, but thanks to the more aggressive nature of this game, Street Fighter V became the game where everybody looked at this mechanic that had been around since forever and said, you know what, maybe that's become outdated. Maybe we don't need that anymore. I have never seen a Street Fighter where people get stunned this much. It felt like a law where every single match had to have someone get stunned in it. And boy, you know what just feels so good in a fighting game? When the game turns to you and says, you don't get to play right now. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for putting in mechanics that punish you for playing poorly. This wasn't that. This was, I hit you with one combo, you guessed wrong on wake up, now you're stunned, GG, shake my hand. Sorry, had to bring that up at some point in time. So, what does this have to do with footsies? Well, Street Fighter was always a series where you had many exchanges between you and the other player. A lot of hits here and there, going back and forth, a real tug of war with each other. But now, you could decimate the opponent with just 2 hits. So, you would see a lot of games where players were constantly going in on the opponent to try and get an opening because it was safe. Or you saw games where the players would just keep going back and forth, walking towards and back, trying to bait something out, trying to feel out that space, find that opening. Because if you did find it and you had the right setup, that's all you needed. You could end the game right there, especially if you had one of those characters that had a really good V-trigger. So yeah, I get why some people say this game was super footsies heavy. And some people said it had horrendous footsies. It was so focused on aggression and landing those big combos, and there wasn't really a lot of moves that you could counterattack compared to previous Street Fighters. But at the same time, that made many players play this game super cautiously because they knew the moment the party started, it would not stop. So you had to rely very heavily on your footsies to find that special opening. So as a result, I've seen people compare this game to both Marvel for how aggressive it was, and, oddly enough, to Samurai Showdown, with how focused the game was on just walking back and forth waiting for that opening where you would decimate the opponent's life. And don't get me wrong, Marvel and Sam Show are amazing series, but they're not Street Fighter. And part of the beauty of Street Fighter is that in the wide world of fighting games, it kinda sat right in the middle. It was that game that no matter who you were, you could pick it up and play it. I'm not saying it was everybody's favorite. I'm not saying everybody loves Street Fighter. No, not at all. But no matter who you were, you could at least find something in the game to appeal to you because Street Fighter was a series with a broad appeal. But now, this game wasn't casting a wide light. Instead, it was focusing its appeal like a laser beam on one specific type of player. And if you were that player, hey, you were loving it. This was the Street Fighter for you. But it was no longer the Street Fighter for everyone. So yes, there were a few issues with this game's combat, and as you can guess, a lot of people tried to come up with excuses for why this game played like this, with the most common excuse being, they changed it to make it simpler for the casual players. This is the number one excuse I have heard from people to describe what they didn't like about the combat. It got rid of moves to make it easier for the casual players to learn. It made the inputs more lenient so that way casual players could pull them off. But do you know who I have heard making these claims? The serious, dedicated players. The online warriors who live in ranked mode. Those are the folks I hear complaining that this combat was focused on casual players. And, well, you're going to have to excuse me here for a second, but I've spent the last several years trying to make this channel a fighting game channel for the casual audience. Our motto on Thorgy's Arcade is, we love fighting games even though we're bad at them. So to everyone who has spent years saying that this combat was aimed at casual audiences, I would just, real quick, like to ask you one simple question. What the f*** are you talking about? Listen, guys, I get it. You didn't like the combat and you want someone to blame, but I assure you, this one ain't on the casual players. Don't you put that evil on them. Speaking as someone who has spent the last year going through every single Street Fighter game, I say this without a hint of exaggeration. This is the least casual and new player-friendly combat in the entire franchise. The only other game that comes close to matching it is Third Strike. But even then, that was the third installment in the series, and Giant Attack was actually pretty decent for new players. So it doesn't really feel fair to compare the two. And even then, without knowing a single thing, just hopping into Third Strike for the very first time, there's still a chance that you can do something cool. You can understand what the parries are and how to do them. It might be hard to pull off, but you can figure it out. And I stress, I am specifically talking about the combat. I'm not even covering the lack of single-player content. Yes, we all know you get rid of single-player content, you're going to turn off that casual audience. We don't need to go into that. No, talking specifically about the combat, this is aggressively anti-casual and new player friendly. Alright, first off, I already talked about the it's not a bug, it's a feature that was the accidental supers, which allowed high-level players to do cool stuff, but made casual players want to throw their disc in a wood chipper. And I mentioned the game felt less expressive, locking players into specific combos, which yes, did upset high-level players. But it also made casual players feel like they weren't doing anything unless they managed to land that one big, very specific and very precise combo that they were probably having trouble with. Yes, removing so much expression did make high-level players feel like the skill ceiling was being lowered. But making the combos so precise also demolished the skill floor, and I cannot stress this enough. When talking about how much a game appeals to casual players, the floor is just as important as the ceiling. In case I'm still not making my point clear, let me phrase it like this. Street Fighter V felt like a game that always wanted you to play it optimally. It wanted you to play this at peak performance. If you weren't playing this with your frame data on screen and going back and re-watching all your replays, you were doing it wrong. The moment that you bought your copy of Street Fighter V, you signed yourself up for the Capcom Pro Tour, otherwise, why do you even buy it in the first place? And hey, That's a great mentality if you're a competitor. But casual fans don't really care about that. They care about doing stuff that's fun, doing stuff that's cool. Which brings me to my next big point. This game just didn't really have anything in the basic combat that made it feel fun or cool. I already danced around this with the whole cool moves budget discussion, but if you were new to this game and you didn't know how to use your V trigger just right or how to set up your combos with your EX attacks, there wasn't really anything that made this game feel good. And you might be thinking, well, Street Fighter 4 brought in a lot of casual audiences and it didn't have anything that made you feel cool either. And to that I say, yeah, this right here, this takes 0 brain cells to pull off, and yet it feels so damn good. You absorb someone hit and counter them, oh, that feels good. You fully charge through someone blocking and crumple them, oh, that feels amazing. And it just took 2 buttons that you could do at any time. And yes, it also had more functions that you had to be a more skilled player to realize. And yes, if you just throw it out there a lot, then your opponent is going to be able to easily punish you for it. So it had variety to it, while also having a reason to not just keep constantly spamming it out there. And that's all good, but the most important thing is it let you do this. And I know you might be saying, well, Street Fighter 2 didn't have anything like that, Street Fighter Alpha didn't have anything like that, Street Fighter 3 didn't have anything like that. That's because those games were 25 years old at this point. The cool thing in those games were that you could do a Hadouken, or you could do a super, or you could do a parry. We're in a whole new era now, and you needed more. And if you look at other fighting games coming out at this time, yeah, they were all learning that. Mortal Kombat X had big crazy X-ray attacks and stage interactables. Tekken had crazy zooming in cameras and slow-mo finishers. Guilty Gear had the best looking cel-shaded graphics of all time, insta-kills, and a power-up that made it sound like a chorus of demons was cheering you on. Street Fighter had the same supers they had in the last game, but now they came out on accident half the time. Oh, and also you only got to use one of them now. Yeah, this was the first Street Fighter since Street Fighter 2, where you only got one super. And I'm sure someone right now is going to say, hey, there was something cool this game let you do. It was the V-Trigger. Why aren't you talking about the V-Trigger? Yes, let's talk about V-Trigger, shall we? For starters, speaking of giving your players things that make them feel cool, I brought it up before, but in Street Fighter 4, if you lost half your life, then they gave you an Ultra Combo. And what did that look like? Ooh, that felt good, didn't it? Now, if you lose half your life in Street Fighter 5, they give you a V-Trigger. And what did that look like? Okay. Quick question. What did that do? No, seriously, what do these do? I hit the buttons, and now my hands are glowing. What did that do? This, to me, is the biggest reason why this game was so off-putting to new and casual players. The V-Trigger was a unique ability for every single character, and for a few of them it was a single move, but for the vast majority of characters, it was some kind of a super state that altered your moves. But there was nothing in the game at launch that told players how it altered their moves. If you went to your combat list and looked under your V-Trigger, it just said the name of the V-Trigger. And that was it. No description of what it did, no demonstration, and sure, some of your moves would say changes during V-Trigger, but it wouldn't say how. And you might think, well, if you just activate it and then try it out, you'll see what the V-Trigger does. Sure, you'll probably figure it out after a few tries, but again, we're talking about the casual and the new player audiences here, and that audience might not be able to pick up on as many things as the dedicated diehard audience can without any guidance. And if you do go into training mode and you test it out, how do you know you found everything? How do you know that your moves don't, I don't know, now do something completely different if you're holding a different direction that you weren't told about? How do you know that you can't now, I don't know, charge up one of your moves if you keep holding the button down, because it doesn't tell you you can do that, and most people, especially new players, aren't going to just think, well, maybe if I just keep holding this button down rather than pressing it. How do you know that now you can't link two different moves together that you couldn't link together before? It doesn't say anything about that. It just says your moves are different. The V-trigger, the entire unique mechanic of this whole game, gives you glowy hands, and it tells you that changes something, but it doesn't do a single thing to explain to you what it changes. And that is insane to me. And I'm sure that some people are going to say, well, we're in the modern age at this point. If you want to know what your V-trigger did, just go online and watch a video on it. True, the FGC was all over YouTube at this point, and there were tons of helpful videos out there of people explaining in detail everything that you need to know about Street Fighter V, including from Capcom themselves. Credit where credit is due, they did actually put up videos on their YouTube channel outlining everything that you could do with these characters. However, again, we're not talking about the dedicated players who are studying their frame data. We're talking about the casual player base. And the moment you tell that casual player base, oh, you want to know how to play this game? Okay, stop playing the game and go somewhere else. You have now lost that casual player base. That is why I say this game is aggressively anti-casual and new player friendly. To understand how this game plays, you have to leave. So just to sum up, to everyone saying this game's combat was bad because they were trying to aim it at casual players. Hey, maybe that was their intent. Maybe the gang over at Capcom had that exact plan in mind. But if you're going to make that statement, it's only fair that you also follow it up with, and they failed. Whew. Okay, sorry. I've kind of been holding that one in for a couple of years now. So yes, there are a lot of problems with this game's combat. High-level players found it to be too restrictive. Casual players found it to be too, however you want to describe the last 5 minutes of this video. Street Fighter V had a bad skill ceiling and an even worse skill floor. But it had a really nice second floor studio apartment. I said that there are people out there who love the combat in this game, and despite the fact that I just complained for so long, I'm pretty sure I blacked out at one point. I do still understand why people say that. For starters, I said that Street Fighter V was a more aggressive game, and hey, I understand loving aggressive combat. I get wanting to just keep attacking over and over. So yeah, there were some players that loved the idea that you could just waste your opponent in 2 combos, and you could just keep attacking because so many moves were safe. And I also said that a lot of the high-level players found the combos to be too restrictive, and casual fans didn't really find there to be anything interesting in the game unless you could do those high-level combos. However, if you could pull off those combos, yeah, there's some really cool stuff that you can do in this game. I can't lie, a lot of those combos actually look and feel really darn good when you pull them off. But I also said that because of this aggression, it also placed a lot of importance on your spacing, on finding those openings and what pokes would work. And because of that, it made that moment when players are in neutral and just staring each other down very tense. And a fighting game should make you feel tense. And I said that this game lacked expression because the combat felt limited. However, I have heard the players who enjoy this game say they find it to have a ton of variety because it is a game where you can find unique things to do in every situation. Like, there will be some crazy combo that you can do only from a very specific distance on a character who is crouching. Or you can do something really wild, but only if you hit the opponent with a crush counter when they're jumping at you from a very specific angle. So yes, there was a variety to the situations that you could respond to, and sure, that's true for all fighting games, or at least it should be true. But I have heard fans of Street Fighter V gush about how much fun it is to go into training mode and find every situation they can come across and figure out the answers to those situations. I've heard them talk about how much fun it is to go, okay, when this character is doing this exact attack, I can respond with this exact attack, and that leads into this exact combo. So yes, even the precise combat that I said a lot of people weren't enjoying can be fun if you approach it with a certain mindset. And I mentioned that the Cool Moves budget for this game was low. You had to work hard to build up those resources. And when you got them, oh, you better make them count because you're only going to get one shot at this. And most audiences, yeah, they found this to be way too restrictive. However, there's a whole other audience out there that loves restrictions. They want their fighting game to come with huge restrictions. If they could add a Dark Souls style stamina bar into your Street Fighter game, they would do it in a heartbeat. They love seeing what you can do with just a few pokes, with just a few tools. They love it when a game gives you those tools that you then have to hold on to like they're the last few dying embers in a blizzard, because then you have to decide, alright, do I spin this meter now on an EX move in order to start up this combo? Or do I save it for my big critical art super? And between that and how deadly some of the combos in this game can be, yeah, Street Fighter was a game where decisions were really important. And again, I know I just described every single fighting game out there. Every fighting game is just a series of decisions. That's all they are. But when your tools are so limited in a game like this, and your opponent's tools can take you out so easily, yeah, it makes these decisions really matter. So, as I said, a lot of people out there did actually like Street Fighter V. But as you can tell from how long I cover the problems, most people weren't really feeling it. And as a result, this game did not do well. It was met with very okay reviews, a lot of 7 out of 10s from critics, but the reaction from regular players was a bit more harsh. The amount of bad word of mouth this game was receiving was stunning. There were so many players trash-talking this game and telling people to stay away from it. And stay away they did! The game released in February, and Capcom expected it to sell 2 million copies by the end of March when their fiscal quarter ended. But it only sold 1.4 million copies, and if those numbers sound familiar, that's the exact expectation to actual sales split that Street Fighter Cross Tekken had. If you saw a movie with a coincidence like that, you'd be complaining it was unbelievable. In April, Yoshinori Ono would tell Game Informer, quote, "I think it's safe to say we underestimated the popularity of some of the single-player content." And in May, Capcom CEO Kenzo Sugimoto got on an earnings call and said, quote, "Some of the aspects of Street Fighter V needed more polish, such as the lack of content and server issues at launch. Accordingly, we feel it's better to give a little more time to development than before." And at the risk of sounding arrogant, I would just like to say to that comment, no! The hell you say! So yeah, Street Fighter V was off to a rough start. However, as I said earlier, this game would be embracing the live service format, and they had continuous new characters planned to drop all throughout the year. And I'll give them credit for this. Street Fighter V introduced a brand new form of currency, and I know these days you hear a live service has its own currency and it sends shivers down your spine, but hear me out. This new currency, called Fight Money, would be awarded anytime that you leveled your character up through online fights or by playing through their individual stories. And you could use this fight money to buy these new characters. Now, granted, you only got 1,000 fight monies by leveling up, and it took 100,000 fight monies to buy a character. But if you played through each character's story mode, you would have enough to buy one character. So it's kind of like this game had 16 characters and then one unlockable character. Still not great, but hey, it was something. And I do know some online warriors who spent tons of time playing through ranked, and they were able to buy every single character without actually spending any real money. So, if you were really dedicated to this game, it would pay off. And that's way more than I can say for a lot of modern day live service fighting games. So the first year this live service venture began. First new character to be released was Alex from Street Fighter 3. This was an awesome addition. He's another fan favorite character. He was the pro tag of Street Fighter 3, so players spent all of Street Fighter 4 waiting for him to arrive. So him being the first DLC character in this game was a huge deal, and dear God, what did they do to Alex? Oh, buddy, I don't think your foot's supposed to bend that way. Okay, the game still didn't look good. We all know that. No point in dwelling on that. The important thing is, Alex was here, and he was a good inclusion, and I will say, I did have some fun with him. Then, after that, we got Guile, who... wow, really? Guile? I mean, Guile's a classic. He's a big deal in the Street Fighter world, but he's so basic. Like, he's important to Street Fighter, but he's so important that you have to wonder, why weren't you here at launch? It would be like if they made a Dragon Ball game and you saved Tien for DLC. Nothing against Tien, we love Tien, we stand Tien in this house. But that dude is base roster or bust. It's not somebody you get excited for with the DLC. And after that, Capcom kinda went radio silent. There was a big delay in this season pass, and Capcom waited a while to tell everyone, breaking the trust that a lot of players had with them, and after that launch, trust was something Capcom was in short supply of. But the third character, Ibuki, got pushed back a month and released alongside the fourth character, Balrog. Another character who people like, but as DLC? Really? But then the final two characters were a big breath of fresh air. Juri and Urien. Alright, you got the biggest fan favorite from the last game and a really solid choice from Street Fighter 3. And I was so excited for this because after all this time, nobody in this roster was sticking with me. I thought Rashid was alright, but then I got bored with him. Ken wasn't hating like he did in the last game. And when it came to the DLC, yeah, I had some fun with Alex for a couple of days, but then I lost interest pretty quick. But Juri, I loved Juri in Street Fighter 4. She was one of the most fun characters in that game, so putting her in this game was sure to, dear God, what did you do to Juri? What the hell are these? They turned Juri into some kind of a charge character, but not a charge character like Guile. No, I mean, she had to charge up a move before she could use it. They took away some of her best moves and replaced them with 3 attacks that you can't even use. You have to do a kick that then stores the move, so that way it can come out the second time you do that kick. And this just reminded me of everything that I didn't like about Street Fighter V's combat. Because I know somebody is going to argue, well, if you actually store up all 3 of her moves at once, then connect an attack, and then combo that attack into those 3 moves, you can do them each back to back. And that means you'll end up doing an attack that's technically better than anything she could do in the last game. Yes, you're right. If you store up all 3 of her moves, she can do one combo that's pretty good. But it's not, hold on while I store up these 3 stocks that I need to be in the exact right setup to use. Good. Again, it's the problem with the Cool Moves budget. That one combo is cool, but the price that Cool Moves budget is asking for is way too high. And as for her feature, actually, you know what, it's not bad. She gets to activate her Feng Shui engine, and just like in the previous game, for a limited amount of time, she can now combo every single one of her moves together. Yeah, that's actually pretty cool. Except for the fact that unlike in the previous game, now every single time that you combo a move together, it dramatically lowers how much time you have left to use this ability. So it's like the game just turns to you and goes, alright champ, you can finally do the fun thing. Whoa, slow your horses there. We still have to make sure that we use the fun thing responsibly. You see, by placing restrictions on these moves, we ensure that every player has an even balanced experience in this game. And oh my god, just let me do the cool thing, you freaking narc of a fighting game. Street Fighter V was the Street Fighter that liked to remind the teacher they forgot to assign homework on the weekend. Juri was such a big hit in the last game, and here she just landed like a deflated balloon. Also, this is far more superficial and specific, but screw it, I'm already on a roll here, so let's just do it. Juri had one of the best designs in the entire series, and they got rid of it to give her this super generic spy uniform that has no personality to it and could go on like 20 other fighting game characters. I hate this look. Luckily, you can spend money to buy her old costume, and wait, hold up, nope. We're gonna talk about the costumes, that is important. We're gonna circle back around to it though, because there's too many other things to talk about now. But that brings us to September, when the final character, Urien, was released, and yeah, he played alright. But I will admit, even though I didn't spend a ton of time with Urien in Street Fighter 3, even I found myself thinking, I'd rather be playing Street Fighter 3 Urien right now. Although I will say they made his Aegis Reflector his V-Trigger, and I remember this being one of the first V-Triggers that actually felt like it was worth the work that went into building it up. This was actually kinda cool. However, when Urien released, there were a few other updates, including some new stage KO animations, the legendary mythic versus CPU mode. Yes, it took them 7 months to include the option to do single-player matches against the computer, and the most important update, malware. This update downloaded a rootkit onto PC players' computers, which made their systems vulnerable to hackers. Holy crap! They spent half a year trying to put fires out, and then at the very end of their season, they just handed a can of gasoline to an arsonist. They did jump in there and removed it pretty quickly, but it just left people wondering, why? Why the hell was this in there? Why did you include backdoor malware programs into my Street Fighter game? Honestly, I think it's for the same reason everything else was broken in this game. They were overworked and behind schedule. These devs had to work so quickly that they had to just throw out there whatever they had without being able to properly inspect it, and in the end, that resulted in them taking a program that had malware in it and just shoved it out there without even realizing it. However, there was one other update that went out in this first year. This game suffered heavily from a lack of single-player content, but the staff at Capcom USA convinced the team at Japan to include a story mode in this game. Not single-character story modes, no, one big, massive cinematic story mode. It had worked so well for Mortal Kombat, so the Capcom USA team convinced Capcom Japan to include it. It would be a huge selling point for this game, and it took them a long time to get ready, so long it kept getting delayed. But who cares? It was all going to be worth it. This was the first time we were ever getting a big story mode in Street Fighter. It was historic, and when it arrived, it would be worth all the pain of that first year. They spent months telling us, don't worry, the single-player story mode is on the way. It's coming. The story mode will be here soon, and when it arrives, it will make everything in this game complete. And then, in July 2016, the Street Fighter V story mode, A Shadow's Fall, finally arrived. This is the worst story mode in any fighting game. Ever. I know you're going to say, no, it's not. There were worse ones. If there are, I haven't played them, and trust me, I've played a lot. There is nothing that compares to the colossal cluster fudge that is Street Fighter V story mode. It's so bad, I'm not going to talk about it. At least, not here. Yeah, this is how bad this story mode is. I am not kidding you, this is true. I originally did write up a summary of this story mode that went through discussing all the problems, and that went on for an hour. And I'm sorry, as much as I know people wanted to see it, I can't just stop this entire video right in the middle to go on a 1 hour tangent about this story mode. That would make the structure of this video horrible, almost as bad as the structure of Street Fighter V story mode. So, here's what we're going to do. Instead of going through this entire story mode, I'm going to give you the bullet points. And if after listening to all that, you still, for whatever reason, still want to see me go through the entire story mode beat by beat, I will be uploading that as a separate video. Should be going up about a week after the premiere of this video. If it's already up, check the card that's popping up now or the description down below. So if you want to just go and watch that video, click those links. But for everyone else, here's the quick rundown. Shadow's Fall is meant to be the story that leads into Street Fighter 3, finally connecting the events of Street Fighter 2 and 4 to 3. How the hell is this timeline so confusing? Shadowloo launches several satellites called Black Moons into the sky, which shut down power around the world. Rashid is trying to rescue a friend of his from Shadowloo, a programmer who Shadowloo kidnapped and forced to build the Black Moons. So he teams up with a mysterious woman named Colleen, who is trying to take down Bison for her master, who we later learn is Gil. In fact, that was even her standing next to Gil in character endings in Street Fighter 3. Colleen also uses the Secret Society's technology to revive Charlie Nash, who comes back as a very pissed off Frankenstein who only wants to stop Bison. But they're not the only ones trying to stop Bison, as someone else is assembling fighters to take him down. That someone? Karine from Street Fighter Alpha. And yes, having two teams being organized by two blonde ladies named Colleen and Karine is very difficult to keep track of. Thank you for asking. Now, I have no idea why they decided to do this, but Karine is now basically the Nick Fury of the Street Fighter universe. Like, why are Interpol agents taking orders from a girl whose defining character trait is she has money? Actually, you know what? Never mind. Moving on. The hero storm Bison's base, Rashid learns he failed to save his friend, but he beats up Fong to get revenge. Charlie Nash challenges Bison and dies accomplishing nothing. Then Ryu comes in and beats Bison and saves the day, while Chun-Li finds a young girl in the base named Lee Fin, who was that girl in her ending in Third Strike, and I guess she just adopts her. So, what were the problems with this story? The graphics look horrendous. Hair and clothing is constantly clipping like the entire game is being held together by electrician's tape. The plot constantly jumps from one moment to the next with no sense of time or synergy. Things just happen and characters just appear because the plot has to move ahead no matter what. Dialogue is so horrendous to the point where if this game was made 7 years later, I would be convinced it was made by AI and then fed through Google Translate. So many fighters are written out of character, ranging from flat and bland to wildly different to downright offensive. Yeah, I hinted at this earlier, but every single trace of Birdie's old personality from the Alpha games is gone now, and instead every line out of his mouth is just,
Huh? I'm way too hungry. Yes, I've earned my meal. But bloody hell, I'm starving. I need to eat something. Need food. This is delicious. I never ate like this before. If you escape, they won't feed me anymore. He's fat.
The events of this story are so poorly thought out that you can just feel how quickly they had to get this out. It feels like there wasn't time for even a first draft. It feels like they just wrote down notes on events and had to go from there. Like, there are major events in this story that make zero sense. Maybe the best example of this is there is a moment where Cammy has to fight some local police officers because they're trying to arrest DiCaprio. Cammy, Shadaloo is an international terrorist organization, and you and Chun-Li work for Interpol. You outrank local cops on this one. All you have to do is flash your badge, and you can save DiCaprio. What are you doing? There are so many characters and storylines that just do not matter. I didn't even mention Nikali is in this story, because even though he opens this story and he's the first threat you come across, he is gone for an hour after that, and then just shows up to die because they clearly forgot that they had to do something with him. And major important plot points are practically skimmed over. Ryu in this story actually manages to overcome the Satsui no Hado, the thing that he's been fighting against, the thing that has been his major driving plotline for 20 years now, is finally resolved. And it happens off screen. Ryu just leaves the story because he can't control the Satsui no Hado anymore. An hour later, shows up again, everything's fine. And almost no character actually has a resolution to their storyline, with the biggest example being Charlie, who spends the entire story talking about how he must destroy Bison no matter what, and then he dies again, not even leaving a scratch on him. This story is such a massive, stinking crater of quality. It's almost impressive. You have to actually work for a story to be this bad. And this is what we were waiting on for half a year, and this is why the game didn't have so many other features. But there you have it, everyone. We have now come to the end of our look at Street Fighter V. I want to thank all of you for joining me today. If you want more content from us, then make sure that you hit that subscribe button. Wait a minute! I'm still only on season 1 of this thing! I got like 4 more of these to go through! Okay, so the first year of Street Fighter V wrapped up, and trust in this game was somehow even lower than it was at launch. We had spent half a year saying this game needed single-player content, then they gave us single-player content, and it was so bad, we just said, nah, that's cool, we're good. I think I'm just gonna go and play King of Fighters. That's not a joke, by the way. Around this time, other fighting game franchises started to see a rise in popularity, and a lot of people have theorized it was because Street Fighter fans were making a mass exodus from their game and looking for something else to play. However, while the average player wasn't having the best time, things were going pretty well for the esports side. Yeah, Street Fighter V had a strategy for success. Focus on the live service aspect, and focus on esports. And the live service side was, we'll check back in with that later. But the esports side was doing alright. In 2016, Street Fighter received over 5,000 entries at EVO, making it not just the most attended game that year, it was the highest attended game in EVO history. The year before that, Street Fighter 4 only had 2,200 entrants. So even if the netcode was bad and people were complaining about the gameplay, the competitive crowd was still showing up for Street Fighter 5. And with Street Fighter 4, I mentioned we were starting to see the rise of fighting game content creators, but with Street Fighter 5, we saw a whole new wave of those creators rising up, which fleshed out the game's popularity, especially considering how many people were going online and Googling, what the heck do the V-triggers do? Point is, resources like YouTube and Twitch were helping to promote this game, and Capcom was taking advantage of that, streaming so many more tournaments than they had ever done before, and they were even going beyond just the online scene, and they worked out a deal to stream their tournaments on ESPN, a huge step forward for this game's competitive scene. And then Season 2 began, and people had some high hopes for this season. Old characters were getting rebalanced with some brand new combo potential, and new characters were being added. First up was Akuma, now with a big lion mane, and hey, it was Akuma. People like Akuma, not much more needs to be said. Although I will go into some details about the story mode because it actually does a lot of work. It opens with him fighting Gin, and it looks like Akuma actually kills him. You remember how Gin and Akuma had this rivalry? Well, apparently that's no longer a thing. Apparently this was their final battle, in a game where Gin wasn't even a playable character. But then Nikali pops up, and Akuma proceeds to kill him too, in probably the most humiliating way possible. Yeah, Nikali goes out so poorly in this game, I can only assume he was forced on the developers by a higher up and everyone else hated him. When he first appeared, it looked like he was going to be the big villain of the game, and he went out, not with a bang, but with a sound of suffering from pain as if throwing up continuously. Great job, writers. I'm glad you went into those details. We really needed them. Akuma, because this whole series is just martial arts Star Wars, then senses a disturbance in the Force. Ryu has gotten rid of the Satsui no Hado, and like a mirror reflection of Obi-Wan and Anakin, Akuma goes to Ryu and tells him, "You were the chosen one! You were supposed to cast your soul into darkness, not bring balance to it!" Akuma challenges Ryu, saying that his Satsui no Hado will challenge Ryu's new power, the Mu no Ken, or Power of Nothingness. This is a power that had been introduced in the lore of this series long ago, but they had never really gone into many details about within the games themselves. But essentially, it's the power to go beyond any emotions, achieving a higher level of understanding, and thereby opening brand new potential to Ryu's powers. In fact, it was actually this power that allowed Goken to survive Akuma's raging demon when they were younger. So, Akuma beats Ryu, but he doesn't kill him, which might imply that like Goken, now that Ryu had the Mu no Ken, Akuma can't kill him. His Satsui no Hado can't finish him off anymore because Ryu has ascended above hatred, the main power source of the Satsui no Hado. Or maybe, just maybe, it's something else. Because as Akuma is leaving, Ryu tells him he's going to keep pushing forward, keep looking for answers through battle. And Akuma actually smiles. So maybe, after all this time of Akuma trying to corrupt Ryu, now that he knows he can't, he now sees Ryu as something he hasn't had in a long time. A rival. And he finds some kind of joy in that. Listen, this game's story mode is really bad. So anytime that I actually see a real breadcrumb of character development, I have to stop and point it out, even if I'm making up half of it in my head. But when it came to the other characters in Season 2, Capcom announced something surprising. Every single other character would be brand new. A bold choice. This game still needed to get people excited, but instead of trying to throw in some fan favorites, they were going to risk it all on new faces. First up was Colleen. Makes sense, she was all over the story mode, so it was a smart choice to include her. But everyone kinda saw it coming, so there wasn't a lot of surprise. She's alright, she uses some ice attacks, has some decent setup to her moves. As I mentioned, she was Gil's right hand and grew up in a war zone where she didn't even have a name. But she was saved by Gil, so that's why she's fiercely loyal to him. Next is Ed, and you might not recognize the name, but you've definitely seen him before. Remember in Street Fighter 4, Balrog was clearing out the SIN base when he found a child with psycho powers? Yep, that's Ed. He was a young boy who Xiaolu experimented on to give him psycho powers so that way he could be a possible backup body for Bison. And Ed admits even he doesn't know if he's a real human Xiaolu kidnapped or an artificial body grown in a lab. Although the fact that he had a crazy growth spurt since the last game kind of implies that he doesn't age normally. And even though Balrog originally wanted to use him because he thought that he could make some cash off of his powers, he eventually ended up caring for this kid, and the two of them became something of a family, with Balrog even teaching him how to box. Again, there ain't a lot of character development within this game, but Balrog actually learning to care about someone other than himself is actually kind of a nice touch. But after Xiaolu fell and Bison died, Ed started to have nightmares about Bison taking him over. He knew he had to do something about this, so he set out to find all the other people Xiaolu experimented on to form their own team. In this game, they started calling themselves New Xiaolu, but spoiler alert, in the next game, the writers realized how stupid it is that the guy trying to free everyone from Xiaolu would then call his team New Xiaolu. So they retconned it to say, no, we're not New Xiaolu, we're not associated with them, we're fighting against them, just everyone else started calling us New Xiaolu. Yeah, gee, why would everyone do that? I don't know, maybe it's because you guys started wearing the actual uniforms? Just one of many examples of how this game really didn't think things out, and a preview of how Street Fighter 6 had to play cleanup. Now Ed would actually be one of the more popular characters with newer players. Not because of his story or his character, and definitely not because he had one of the worst costumes in the game. No, instead, it's because he was one of the easiest characters to learn because Ed had simplified inputs. No quarter circles or half circle inputs. Instead, if you want to do a special move, just hit 2 punches together, or hit punch in a direction. This was really different for Street Fighter, but as I said, people who were having trouble with Street Fighter V's combat found him to be very easy to pick up and play, which, as I point out, was something this game needed. What the game did not need, however, was the next character, Abigail. Abigail was another character from the original Final Fight, because Yoshinori Ono was a huge Final Fight fan and wanted more of a focus on that series. Abigail was a former member of the Mad Gear gang, but when they disbanded, he started up his own auto shop in Metro City because he loves cars. He is also a massive idiot. His entire story mode is just him crying when he forgot where he parked his car, and then making car sounds, then beating people up because they call him stupid or they think he farted.
Ugh, what the? Did you fart?
Remember when I said Yoshinori Ono ushered in a goofier era for Street Fighter? Well, Street Fighter 4 cranked that goofy knob up a notch. Street Fighter 5 yanked that knob off the dash. We already saw it in the story and in the characters like Fong, but Abigail was the peak. Also, I feel I should point this out, Abigail is the first Canadian Street Fighter character, and I would like to take this moment to apologize to my northern neighbors. You guys deserve way better than this. As for how he plays, it feels like they had a challenge to make someone even bigger than Hugo. So they made Abigail the biggest character in this series, and he plays exactly as you'd expect someone that size to play. Slow, tanky, but he hits like a truck. Now speaking of Abigail, fans weren't really feeling these new characters, and throughout Street Fighter V's life, they were not quiet about it. A year after this, Capcom did a poll to rank the popularity of all the Street Fighter characters, and not including the characters from Street Fighter 1 who never returned again, or all the non-canon characters from the EX and movie games, 6 out of the bottom 10 characters were all created for Street Fighter V. And honestly, that should really be 7 out of 10 because the bottom character is Birdie, and I can guarantee you that is entirely because of how he's depicted in Street Fighter V. Yeah, I'm not saying Alpha Birdie was a top 10 character or anything like that, but he definitely would not have been this low on the charts. However, the next character to be introduced was Minot, and Minot was actually pretty cool. She's Rosa's apprentice, and just like her, she can use soul power. She's an inexperienced fortune teller from Egypt who's upbeat, kinda quirky, kinda silly, and just a dash mysterious. And after the last 3 characters, people needed something to get them excited. And I remember when Minot got introduced, people were actually kind of interested in her. She had a great design, a unique playstyle, and she's probably got the best animations in the game. That was another reason people found the combat in this game to be so boring. So many characters had no personality to their animations. But Minot was loaded with personality. I mean, this is the most feeling yourself walk cycle I've ever seen in a game. However, I said her playstyle was unique, but it was also hard. She fights by saying her crystal ball on the stage to trip up the opponent, which requires a lot of brain power and forward thinking. She was kind of the opposite of Ed. So yeah, there's a lot that people liked about Minot, but her gameplay didn't get a lot of them to stick with her. In September 2017, when she was introduced, she was the 6th most used character in the game. But the very next month, she plummeted down to 3rd from the bottom, and she would remain around that spot throughout the rest of the game's life. My point is, she's a fun character, people got excited for her, but after they played her, they realized she wasn't going to be the character that saved this game. And the final character of Season 2 was Zeku. Zeku is Guy's master and the head of the Bushinryu clan. We've even seen him before in Guy's Ending in the alpha games. However, he is now splitting off from his school to start a brand new ninja style. One that involves big sharp slash attacks and a transformation technique that lets him jump between a young and old form. And if this slashing effect sounds familiar, and you think you recognize that red scarf, there's a reason for it. In his ending, he's trying to come up with a name for his new clan, and he comes up with Striders. Yes, this game confirms that the Strider Hiryu games are set in the future of the Street Fighter universe. So you can now add that next to Final Fight for games in Capcom's shared universe. I actually dig Zeku. I like his personality of serious old ninja who's trying to be hip. And I didn't play much of him when he came out, although that was mostly because after Season 1 I kind of fell off this game. But when recording footage for this video, I finally tried to learn him, and yeah, I had fun with him. But not a lot of other players were having fun with, well, pretty much anything. Again, this game did have its fans, it did have people who loved it, but we were now at the end of Season 2, and I pointed out how well the competitive scene was doing in that first year. After the second year, there was a drop-off. According to Steam charts, the PC players were around the mid-thousands at this point, whereas games like Tekken 7 were around 4,000. And this just wasn't a case of, oh, the game has been out for a while, so it's natural for people to not be playing it as much. No, the dedicated players who had stuck with this game for the past 2 years, they were flat out not happy. YouTuber Born Free had a series on his channel throughout Street Fighter V's life where he interviewed pro players. And at the end of Season 2, they were outspoken about how not fun the game was. They said it wasn't complex enough, the game was horribly unbalanced, with some characters' V-triggers just practically being win conditions. And many players even accused Capcom of not caring about making a good game with balanced combat. They said Season 2 felt more aggressive because they thought Capcom just wanted to create a spectacle. They just wanted to make something that esports audience could enjoy watching from home.
Street Fighter 5 is the esport game. They want to make Street Fighter 5 more like an esport game. So you have to please the audience, not players.
Season 2 kind of sucks.
Why?
Because of what the game has turned into. Like, Season 1, there was still, a lot of explosiveness, but it wasn't 100% about the explosiveness.
Yeah.
Now, it's like, your neutral game doesn't really matter because, the best characters, Laura, Balrog, Urian, they don't care if they lose neutral because they're going to have X Factor at the end of the round anyways.
It's still,
it's
really stressful.
It's the same. Yeah, you'd think, okay, after a while, it's going to get easier for top players, which it has. But it's still stressful as hell.
Yeah.
Like, you could still lose to anybody.
Yeah.
You can't make one mistake. Unforgiving. Very unforgiving game. It's like we're playing Marble. Like, if I wanted to play Marble, I'll play Marble right now.
Right,
Right.
This game needed something that could get people back into it. And that something might just have been around the corner. In January of 2018, Street Fighter did what Street Fighter does best, released a brand new version of itself. Street Fighter V Arcade Edition was released, and this version would include another season of characters, and it would give every single character a brand new V-trigger that they could choose, which is awesome. It gave characters some variety and helped with that whole lack of expression thing. But get ready for this. Street Fighter V Arcade Edition also included Arcade Mode. Took them almost 2 years, but they finally added it into the game. And hey, credit where credit is due, They went above and beyond with these arcade modes. And I do mean modes, plural. You could choose to do an arcade mode based around Street Fighter V, but you could also do an arcade mode based around Street Fighter 1, 2, Alpha, 3, and 4 as well. Each arcade mode would allow you to pick characters who were either in those respective games or had connections to characters who were. For example, Zeku could do an arcade mode for Street Fighter 1 because Final Fight was made around that same time. Or Laura could do an arcade run for Street Fighter 3 because her brother Sean was in that game. And each character unlocked unique comic pages for each arcade mode they beat, but you could also unlock tons of additional artwork by pulling off certain achievements. I do kind of wish that you could do something with all this artwork, like make it the new background on the menu or something like that, but still, it's really nice that it's in there. And they even put extra details into these arcade modes, like if you beat Street Fighter 2 without losing a life, suddenly you get challenged by Shinakuma. Or spoiler alert for later in this video, but as this series went on, they added Gil as a playable character. And of course, they made him the boss of the Street Fighter 3 arcade ladder. But in that boss fight, if you defeat him while he has 1 bar of meter, he will resurrect just like he did in Street Fighter 3. The amount of work that went into these arcade ladders was insane. Yes, it was ridiculous that this game launched without them. And it took way too long to get them added. But you know what? This actually felt like a big apology. It felt like what the game needed and then some. But that's not all. They also added extra battles. These were modes where you could use your fight money to take on weekly challenges, such as fighting supercharged Shadowloo soldiers to get extra money or experience points. Or more importantly, they started adding costumes to this game that you could only unlock in these extra battles, which was great because Street Fighter V, well, it had been pretty greedy with its costumes, so giving people a way to earn unique ones for free was kind of a big deal. Although, speaking of that, you might be wondering, how was Capcom able to fund this? Weren't they nearly broke and didn't this game sell poorly? Well, here's the thing. Back in 2016, Capcom was in trouble. But since that initial release, Capcom had found a hero.
Welcome to the family, son.
Resident Evil 7 would release in January of 2017, and that game exploded. It sold well above expectations. So suddenly, Capcom found themselves with a little bit of extra money. And then in January 2018, literally the same month as Arcade Edition's release, Monster Hunter World would drop, which went on to become Capcom's highest selling game ever. I bring this up because for this game's first year, Capcom was looking around in the couch cushions to be able to fund it. But now, all of a sudden, Capcom once again had money to spare. Meaning they had money to actually invest in their games. Games like Street Fighter V. But the other reason why Capcom was able to fund this new version is because that live service strategy this game was built around, turns out it actually worked. Yeah, by selling players season passes and continuous updates for brand new characters, they were able to keep funding this game. Although those new characters paled in comparison to how much money was coming in from the costumes. Dear God, the amount of costumes this game was selling was maddening. They needed people to buy cosmetics if this game was going to survive, so they were going to do everything possible to sell them. Which brings me to a point that I wasn't going to touch, but I kept seeing people talking about this, so yeah, we should probably mention it. This game needed to sell costumes to keep it funded, and you know what sells really well? Sex appeal. Listen, I didn't want to go into details about this because I know people are going to think I'm just being a prude, and I'm not. I don't care if you want sexy characters in your fighting game. Nothing wrong with that at all. But there were so many sexy costumes, it reached that point where you had to ask, dear God, how thirsty are these developers? If there was a kink, there was a costume around it. Swimsuits, bunny girls, cheerleaders, and whatever else they decide to shove Chun-Li in. Seriously, I think this game funded an entire season of DLC off Chun-Li costumes alone. And hey, some of them look really cool, but Sean, why is this called your training uniform? What exactly are you training for? Street Fighter V quickly started to develop a reputation around these costumes. ESPN actually had to ban some of these from tournaments because they went against their broadcasting standards. And again, nothing wrong with sexy costumes, nobody's saying that. But when you're doing a retrospective on a fighting game, you need to talk about the general perception of that game. You need to talk about how everyone was looking at the game, and Street Fighter V had just spent the past 2 years being the butt of a lot of jokes in the fighting game community, no pun intended. And I remember around the time that Arcade Edition came out, this was now just one of the things that Street Fighter V was known for. I felt so bad for the people who genuinely liked this game, because so many people started looking at Street Fighter V like, oh, you play Street Fighter V? Uh-huh. I see. Oh, you like it because of the V-trigger? Yeah, I'm sure that's the reason why you like that game. Oh, you like the new characters? Sure you do. And I bet that character having 5 bikini costumes had nothing to do with it, right? But back to the costumes in general, I'm all for adding cosmetics to your fighting games, but it was getting overwhelming. It felt like every single month there was some new costume pack. And it became clear they were pumping these costumes out so fast, they didn't really have time to think them out. Like, some of them look great, they're amazing. And others look so bad, it's clear they were just panicking and shouted, we need a costume. Our coffers are dry and we need that DLC money now. We don't care how it looks, just put it out there. In fact, this is true. Multiple costumes they released ended up getting banned in tournaments because the costumes had things in them that block players' views of the attacks, which could make a huge difference in a fight. Doesn't it feel like the number one rule for making a costume for a fighting game is make sure you can fight against it? And after a few years of this, it started to feel kind of predatory. It felt like they knew there was that audience out there that just needed a new costume. They needed to buy a new outfit for their character, and Capcom was more than willing to take advantage of that. And it was almost even more predatory. This game had fight money that you could use on brand new characters. But originally, there was going to be a second imaginary currency that would be used specifically for costumes. But they were so pressed for time, they couldn't get that secondary currency ready before this game's release, so instead they just put these costumes up for sale in the PlayStation and Steam store because, as I said, they needed money so bad, they needed to start making that DLC costume money now, and they couldn't wait for them to fix the imaginary currency. And thank goodness they did that, because as suspicious as these costume practices were, they would have been so much worse if they said, oh, you can only buy this with 400 Bison dollars. And did we mention we only sell Bison dollars in packs of 350? So that's another reason why this update was a pretty big deal. We now actually had a way to earn some pretty cool costumes just by playing the game. And a few months later, they add another feature to the game. Loot boxes! Okay, hold up, hear me out. They're not nearly as bad as that sounds, but essentially, yeah, that's what they were. You could use your fight money to buy fortune tickets, which then took you to Minot, who could then get you a random item. It could be a costume, it could be some artwork, or it could be an item that you could use in survival mode. And that last one was actually a great addition, because I said that I didn't care about survival mode because there's no challenge for like 10 fights, then you lose and you go all the way back to the start. But now, you could use items from these fortune tickets to give yourself a boost, save you from getting KO'd, and just generally make it a more interesting mode. It transformed this from a boring old survival mode into something closer to a roguelike. I still didn't spend a ton of time in this mode, but I would be willing to call it a fun single-player experience now. These updates were great additions to this game, and I wasn't the only one who thought so. Before this update, this game was sitting in the mid to high thousands on Steam charts. When this update hit, those numbers jumped up to 8,000, the highest player base this game has seen since release. This was huge! Street Fighter V was actually making players happy, and it wasn't just in the game. Throughout its life, Capcom started doing something pretty cool on its website to promote this game. They started showing tons of character concept sketches, giving in-depth interviews on the history of Street Fighter games, and they did spotlights on every possible character in the Street Fighter universe. No matter how obscure they might be, they got a spotlight. Everyone from longtime favorites to backup characters from the Udon comics. In fact, they even did the unthinkable. And they gave a spotlight to... Yes, Xinglong! He returns once again. Thanks to this promotional campaign, Capcom finally gave us an official design for the legendary Xinglong. And... Did I mention yet this was the era of the goofification of Street Fighter? I mean, okay, yeah, sure. We all knew he wasn't going to live up to the hype, but you know what, screw it. He's here, we finally got his eye. Somewhere out there within the Street Fighter universe, he actually exists. Kind of. Also, in case you're wondering why they spell his name like that on here and the page looks a little bit different, it's because this was only shared on the Japanese version of the Capcom website, so I'm having to use Google Translate on this. Also, I think this page has been taken down because the only place I can find it is on the Internet Archives, which is a very handy tool that has allowed me to complete many of these retrospectives. But all this single-player content and online campaigns were nice, but on top of all this, there was a brand new DLC season starting with this launch. And after the last season that was all about brand new characters, this season mostly focused on returning safe choices. Mostly. First up, Sakura. She's graduated from high school and she's working at an arcade and she's kinda going through her quarter-life crisis. Fighting isn't really doing it for her anymore and she feels like she needs more from life. She's thinking about what she's now doing and what her future looks like and it just doesn't really seem to be going anywhere. But after a talk with Ryu, she realizes that what she wants in life is to have kids. Not necessarily with Ryu, I realize I phrased that in a misleading way, but it makes sense in context. This was kind of controversial for a lot of fans. Some people applaud it because, hey, character development. She wants something different in life. She's thinking about her future. But other people felt like it was out of character for her. Like, she's never mentioned families before, and also fighting was always very important to her, so her now being numb to it felt like she was a completely different character. I'm kind of in the middle on this. I applaud them for developing her character more. Having a character question what they're going to do with their life is really impressive. But at the same time, the dialogue in this whole section does not match the tone of Street Fighter. It feels like we're playing a completely different game right now. I mean, what she says in here is a very relatable thing that a lot of people are going to be able to connect to. It's probably going to reach a whole wide audience out there. But at the same time, there's a moment in here in which she says, I can't just board a plane and fly off whenever I want, and all I can think is, this is Street Fighter. This is the game where even a penniless green ape man can board a plane whenever he wants. Air travel in the Street Fighter world is like healthcare in the Pokemon world. You kind of just walk in there and that's all you need. Also, not to get too deep into the lore on this one, although that is something my channel is known for, so why not? But she's working at an arcade and she's talking about how she doesn't know what her future is going to be and how it all just kind of seems numb and pointless right now. And all I could think was, you guys put out some shorts right before Street Fighter 4 came out that were all canonical that shows that Sakura, since the alpha games, had become a big major fighter, going out there and challenging other big heavy hitters, and she was famous for it. What happened to her? Did her manager take all her money? Considering her manager was Dan Hibiki, that's entirely likely. Also, like I said, I do applaud this game for actually doing something this deep with this character, but at the same time, it feels like for something this important, she kind of jumps pretty quickly from, I don't know what I want to do with my life, to, oh, that's it, I want to have kids. It feels like we could have developed that a little bit more, but then again, these little story segments are only like 5 minutes top, so yeah, that probably wasn't possible. Although, speaking of that, playing through all these stories again did make me realize something. There is a theme of families going throughout this entire game. Cammy was looking for a family in the dolls. Laura places a lot of emphasis on her family. Chun-Li adopted Lee Fin and they became a family. Ken's story puts more of a focus on him settling down with his wife and son. Yes, we all know the joke that you're about to post in the comments, save it for the next game. And now, Sakura wants a family. There was definitely a theme of families in Street Fighter V, and I wonder if that was on purpose or if this was all just a wild coincidence. So yeah, I'm okay with this direction for Sakura, and I do applaud them for going through some pretty heavy character development. But they could have made the dour tone match this series a little bit better, and I wish they had spent a little bit more time on this development. Although that does bring me to a little side tangent that I want to talk about. As I said, people argued that this was out of character for her, and after thinking about it, I don't really agree with that argument, but I totally get it. Because as I mentioned when talking about the story, this game seemed to be writing a lot of fighters out of character, or not really understanding what we liked about them. Karin is leading a military task force, Birdie only cares about food, there is nothing of the old Charlie in that zombie body. Juri went from being a cold, calculating, vicious villain to whatever they were going for here.
What? Did you just call me flat, jerk-ass?
And you might think that I'm exaggerating a little bit, and I probably am. Although I do have to bring this up. When looking at the early concept sketches for a lot of these returning characters, some of them were going to be so much worse. The original pitch for Akuma in this game, and I kid you not, this is real, is that he would have a baby on his back, and he would have to stop between his moves to take care of it. They were going to make the ultimate embodiment of hatred and evil a babysitter. And at this point, I know it sounds like I have gone completely off topic here, but no, I wanted to bring this up in this video, and I wanted to wait until we were talking about Sakura, because speaking of early concepts for these returning characters, no matter how you feel about Sakura in this story mode, there was one pitch for her that was just... Well, let's take a look. Okay, let's see now. They had a few different ideas for Sakura. She was going to be working as a mountain tour guide. Okay, that's pretty cool. I can see that. Sushi delivery girl, that could be fun. Working with high-tech motion capture armor, getting a little bit far out there, but none of them compared to, and again, this is real, the chasing Ryu concept, where she was now wearing a big thick sweater and a backpack decked out in Ryu merch that she made herself, and sporting big Coke bottle glasses because she had spent the last several years so obsessed with Ryu that she had ruined her eyesight by looking for him online. And before anyone says, oh, that was probably just an alternate costume they were going to do for her, it probably wasn't the actual character. Remember how I mentioned Capcom was sharing tons of behind-the-scenes details on this game at this time? Yeah, that's where all this comes from, and this was listed under early concepts. This was at one point the pitch that they had for Sakura. She was now going to go from being Ryu's fan to being his creepy stalker. So yeah, speaking of concerns that people have with Street Fighter, I definitely remember this being something in the conversation around Season 3. A lot of longtime Street Fighter fans around this time were now looking at this game and at these characters and how they were being written, and a lot of people were starting to ask, do you guys actually like Street Fighter? But okay, on to something much simpler to talk about. Our next character was Blanca, who was now trying to sell his own homemade dolls called Blanca-chan to help support his mother. Which was worth mentioning because it gave us the greatest costume in the entire game. That's right, you can dress up as the Blanca-chan mascot. And people loved this costume. It was immediately banned from tournaments though because of how much it obstructed attacks, and there was a glitch that caused a time freeze, but players still loved it. Next, another brand new character, Falk. She was another kid experimented on by Bison until she was rescued by Ed. She also kind of looks like Ed, which leans into the theory that both of them were created from scratch in the Shadowloo labs, but she has sworn loyalty to Ed and she acts kind of like a big sister to him and his crew. She fights with a staff and charge attacks that require a lot of forethought, but she also has simplified inputs like Ed, so mechanically, she's a very intriguing character. Next, another return character who went through some major changes. Cody returns, but after serving his time in prison, he's now become the mayor of Metro City. Okay, I know I just got done talking about how a lot of players felt like these fighters were being written so differently that they didn't really resemble the characters that we had come to know and love. Cody is not one of those characters. This is an amazing direction to take Cody. Because after everything that happened to Cody, yeah, he wanted to clean up Metro City. But maybe after spending some time in prison, he had come to learn that just punching people wasn't the way to do it. And after seeing how effective Hagar had been as mayor, yeah, you could understand him taking that same path. And it feels almost like a bit of a redemption for Cody, like Hagar hadn't given up on him. Maybe Hagar even helped him to get into politics. But we see in his story mode, he's kind of bored as mayor, and he still has that itch to go out there and start fights. Because that's who Cody was, and he can't just change that much overnight. This is some of the best character progression out of anyone in this game. It moves his character forward while staying true to who he is, and yeah, most fans agreed. People really like this direction for Cody. But then we got to the final two characters who were released at the exact same time. We got Sagat, who is still living a peaceful life in his village, but after Ryu defeated the Satsui no Hado, That scar in his chest has started to burn, and he's feeling an overwhelming hate crawling up inside of him. We'll get back to that later. Okay, so only one character left, and even though this season was full of a lot of fan favorites, they weren't really grabbing anyone's attention, and even though I personally don't care about stuff like who's good and who's considered top tier, most of the people who do think about that stuff thought this entire season was a letdown. Pretty much this entire season of characters at this point were being ranked mid to low tier. But then, along came the final character, G. G became the biggest mystery of this season and for pretty much the rest of the game's life, because the first time that we ever saw him was in the brand new intro cutscene for Arcade Edition, and everyone looked at him and asked, "Who the heck is this Abe Lincoln looking Uncle Sam dude?" People were so desperate for answers, there was actually a rumor going around, and I swear to you, this was something multiple people were saying. This is not just like one person on the internet said. No, a lot of people actually started to take this rumor and run with it. But there was a rumor that G was going to be a guest character from Bloody Roar of all games, because Ed had a gorilla in his crew. And in Bloody Roar, there was a big guy in a top hat and a beard who could turn into a gorilla, and his name was Greg, which starts with a G. Yes, I know that's crazy, but you have to remember, we got Abigail in the last season. Nobody had any idea where Ono was going to take this game. For all we know, Season 4 was just going to be a bag of magic beans that Ono bought off someone on the street. But when the truth came out, nobody could have guessed that G would actually be a YouTuber. Or actually in this game they call it FooTube, but yeah, it's pretty much YouTube. Yes, G is a man with a YouTube channel who calls himself the President of Earth, and makes speeches on street corners about how we are all one, all of us are part of the Earth. But nobody's really watching his channel, except for Rashid, who can't stop scoping out his competition. Rashid, dude, listen, you gotta just let that go. You can't be obsessed about that kind of things. You're never going to get any actual work on your own channel done. You gotta just focus on yourself. You'll hit those numbers eventually. So Rashid challenges him, and after this fight, suddenly G's message starts to take off. His numbers go up, he's reaching a wider audience, and it looks like his peaceful message might be a bit more sinister than we think. G would remain a huge question mark for this series. What was the intent behind him? What were his ultimate goals? Also, he's got an alternate costume that looks like a hunting outfit from 100 years ago, and he talks with an old-timey twang. What exactly is the deal with G? Is he immortal or something? He can absorb the power of the earth. Is he meant to be like a god? Like Nikali? Please say no. And more importantly, how the hell is he connected to Q? Yeah, he's another character with only one letter in his name. But more importantly, this is his alternate costume. Looks kind of familiar, doesn't it? Also, in the Street Fighter V arcade mode, he can sometimes appear as a surprise fight. Sort of like how Q used to. These questions would deepen as the game's life would go on, and we never got any answers to it, and not everyone was happy with it. You remember how I kept saying that this was an era of goofification of Street Fighter? Well, people spent years wondering what Q's deal was. Who was this mystery robot man? What were his motivations? Who was he really under that mask? And now, after all this time, they brought in some possible answers with G, and he was an Abe Lincoln impersonating YouTuber. Yeah, it just felt kind of off. The tone did not match what people liked about Q. Now personally, I really like G as his own thing. As his own standalone character, I think he's a great addition to this series. But yeah, the moment you try and tie him into Q, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. A lot of fans were looking at this and going, do you actually know what we like about these characters? Because this is so not what we liked about Q. However, when it came to how G played, he was refreshing. I have to repeat myself, there were a lot of people who liked how Street Fighter V played, but there were so many people that were turned off by the more precise combat. They needed everything to be exactly right. And hey, I'll admit, they did several balance changes throughout Street Fighter V's life to address these issues. But yeah, overall, people still had these concerns. But then G came in here, and he felt so much more creative, so much more expressive. And yes, in order to do some of his best combos, you still had to set them up. You had to absorb the power of the earth first, so that way your combos would link. But that was way better than having to wait half the match for your V-trigger to fill up, and it's not like with Jury, where you had to charge up every single move. No, you do one quick charge, and now you're good for the next couple seconds. You can just start comboing like crazy. G was what a lot of players had been waiting on. Unfortunately, he might have been too late. Because despite all these improvements, Street Fighter V's player base was not going up. I did mention that Street Fighter V's Steam numbers spiked when Arcade Edition came out, but a few months later, they dropped right back down to where they were before Arcade Edition. All of this new content was great, and if it had been in there at launch, it definitely would have seen a much higher casual player base sticking with this game and trying to learn everything. But you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. Years had gone by now, and yeah, that casual player base was not coming back. They stopped in for a second to check it out, but they had moved on. And as for the combat, yeah, G was nice, but as I said, pretty much every single other character this season was being ranked kinda low. And this one character wasn't going to bring back all those people who dropped off in Season 1, especially with the fact that the online still wasn't very good. Then there came the biggest hit this game had taken yet, the 2018 EVO numbers. For anyone who doesn't know, EVO started out as a Street Fighter tournament. For its first several years, it only focused on Street Fighter and Capcom games. But even after it expanded to feature all fighting games, Street Fighter still dominated the show. It was constantly the biggest game at EVO, and even though records of entrant numbers before 2008 aren't available, since then, there wasn't a single year where Street Fighter wasn't the highest entered tournament. That is until 2018, when Street Fighter had 2,499 entrants, and Dragon Ball FighterZ had 2,579. Just barely beating it, but it was still the first time since Street Fighter's resurgence with Street Fighter 4 that a game beat it. And don't get me wrong, it's good that Street Fighter was not always the most entered game at EVO. It's good that other games could get that spotlight. It's good to have a big and diverse landscape in the fighting game community. However, when this game had already received so much punishment and so much bad word of mouth and had been the butt of so many jokes, for it to be the Street Fighter that finally lost that top spot, it was a real bad look. And that would be the continuing theme for Street Fighter V for the rest of its life. The next year at EVO, it was crushed by Smash Ultimate, which got over 1,000 more entrants than Street Fighter. But more importantly, that next year, Tekken 7 was quickly gaining steam. At EVO 2018, Street Fighter V had 2,499 entrants, and Tekken 7 had 1,547. Then the next year in 2019, Street Fighter had 1,929 entrants, and Tekken 7 had 1,885. It's one thing for a title to lose players as the years go on, that's totally normal and to be expected. But when you lose players, and then your competitor gains almost those exact same number, it makes you realize, oh crap, it's not that people are dropping off, they're actually going somewhere else. Yeah, interest in Street Fighter was dropping. Even the people who had spent the last 2 years defending this game were starting to get numb to it. Even with all the new characters, a lot of people were just sticking with their mains. We had so many stages to choose from, but because the online was so bad, all you ever saw was just that one soulless training stage over and over and over. The new V-triggers were nice, but it wasn't something that was going to convince anyone new to pick this game up, or bring anyone back who had already left. I mean, a year after Street Fighter 4 came out, they gave everyone brand new cinematic supers. Street Fighter 5 gave everyone a brand new type of glowy hands for 5 seconds. Also worth pointing out that the V-triggers were always considered unbalanced, with some characters just being far better than the others. But that went double for the new V-triggers. A lot of these new V-triggers were just flat out awful, and there was no reason anyone would ever pick them. This game did not have the flash and pizzazz that it needed to bring back players, and the fighting game community as a whole wasn't really helping with that. I've mentioned a few times how the rise of fighting game content creators helped to advertise these games. But around this time, if you were checking out fighting games on YouTube, you saw really creative, amazing edited videos for games like Dragon Ball FighterZ, or Tekken 7, or Smash Ultimate. You looked up content on Street Fighter V, you found training stage, training stage, training stage. And perhaps worst of all, this live service format was designed to help Street Fighter, to allow it to grow slowly over time and bring in a larger audience as the game went on. But now, after 3 years, all these updates were becoming dull. Constantly getting one update after another didn't excite people, it just became white noise, and it made people just want something different. All of this meant that the next season, Season 4, would be very important to the future of this series. But unfortunately, this season started a little aimless. In December of 2018, they revealed a brand new character, Kage. Although, he's not really that new. You see, now that Ryu had banished the Satsui no Hado, they couldn't really include evil Ryu in this game. So they added Kage, who is essentially the embodiment of the Satsui no Hado within Ryu, so he's just evil Ryu. In his story mode, now that Ryu had banished Kage, he goes to Sagat and Akuma trying to take them over, but neither of them succumb to him. Kage then makes one final attempt to take over Ryu, and even though he beats him, Ryu just basically shrugs and says, "Yeah dude, nobody cares about you anymore," and Kage then fades away. Yeah, it's not exactly the best send-off to Ryu's Satsui no Hado. But as for his playstyle, yeah, he's basically just evil Ryu. There are some differences, but that's definitely what they were going for. And after Kage, not much happened. Street Fighter had a pretty solid pattern of announcing a brand new season of DLC, then putting out a brand new character every 2 months. But when Kage came out, they didn't announce a new season of DLC. It was just Kage, by himself. And then months went by without a word, and people were wondering, so is there another season coming? And to make matters worse, in December when Kage was released, there was another edition that did not go over well. Capcom decided to give players a free costume for all their characters. Hey, that's good. They were advertisement costumes, where you could slap a giant brand name on your character to advertise a product or event during the match. And in exchange for getting this branding slapped on your character, you would get 4 to 12 fight monies, depending on how many ads you decide to turn on. I remind everyone, it cost 100,000 fight monies to unlock a new character. Okay, this was a bad look. The live service format of Street Fighter V caused many people to start calling Capcom greedy and manipulative. And now, Capcom was turning to their audience and asking them to put a bunch of advertisements on their character and calling it a free costume that also makes you fight money. Gee whiz, thank you, Mr. Capcom, sir. If I buy the next season of DLC, can I also stand outside your office and spin around a giant sandwich board for you? As you can imagine, that did not go over well. And combine that with the fact that we had no idea if there was another season of characters actually on the way, it made a lot of players think, oh man, is Capcom really that desperate for money? Can they even afford another season? They could, to be clear. As I mentioned earlier, that live service format was paying off for them. This game was bringing in money. But still, asking your audience to slap advertisements on themselves was not a good look. Also, that raises another question. Capcom, if you were doing okay for money, why were you asking us to slap advertisements on our characters? But yes, Capcom could indeed afford another season, and another season was on the way. But for some reason, Capcom just decided to go radio silent for months. But that's because they had a plan. They thought one character every few months might not be enough to get people back into this game, to give it the big boost that it needed. So instead, they were going to surprise everyone, spend months being completely silent about it, and then drop 3 characters all at once. And they were going to announce them all live at EVO as a big surprise. And then the announcement got leaked early because of course it did. Damn, Capcom fighting games getting leaked is a tradition, but twice for the same game? That's a rarity. And this leak hit Ono hard. This was his big plan. Go silent for this long to make one big reveal all at once. Sure, fans are getting mad at you for not saying anything for months on end, but it was all going to be worth it for that moment when you were up on stage and you announced these characters, and now that moment was gone. But that's okay. You can still salvage this. You just gotta make the reveal big and impressive. That did not happen. In fact, the actual reveal probably made things worse. At EVO that year, pro wrestler, serial enthusiast, and Windjammer strongest soldier Xavier Woods got up on stage and tried to hype the crowd up, building up Ono as much as he possibly could to get everyone on his side. But it came off so much more depressing than he probably intended.
A few days ago, you guys all heard about the leak having to do with Street Fighter. Yeah. The people that I know at Capcom, they were devastated. They were hurt. But there's one person in particular who was completely broken by this. He was so upset because he loves being up here on this stage, and it's to the point where he was feeling so down and so ashamed that he doesn't even want to come up here and talk to you guys today. He's that hurt. So can you guys help me out with making some noise trying to get him up here? We're going to give it this. Oh, no, son. Oh, no, son.
Mr. Woods, I love you, but the Street Fighter fanbase had spent the past couple of years worried that Ono might be an ineffective leader who couldn't handle this game. So introducing him by talking about how sad he was didn't exactly put those concerns to rest. Just to give you a contrast, here's how Tekken's director Katsuhiro Harada greeted the crowd when his DLC got leaked.
I'm very upset. I'm very upset. Shut up! Shut up! Shut up and sit the head down! And don't ask me for shit, okay? Okay, guys. There is no leak. There was no leak, okay?
Yeah, that conveys strength. But a man who we were just told is really sad standing up there reading off a giant poster board, even if you weren't there in person, you could feel how uncomfortable everyone was. And with that, before we get to the actual new characters being announced, I think it's time that we finally talked about Ono. Remember in the last episode when I said this? Listen, as we get further into this retrospective, I'll go ahead and warn you. Ono has come to be a bit of a controversial figure within the Street Fighter community, and there's definitely justification for that, and we'll get into that much later. Oh hey, look at the time, it's much later now. In the last episode, I gave Ono a ton of credit for getting Street Fighter up and running again, because yes, he deserves that. The only reason this series came back was because of how much work he put into convincing the higher-ups at Capcom to revive it. Sure, the sales on the Xbox 360 Street Fighter 2 port helped, but nothing would have gotten done without Ono banging on Keiji Inafune's door every single day. And Ono also gave Street Fighter something that other fighting games had, but Capcom was lacking. He gave it a face. Tekken had Harada, Mortal Kombat had Ed Boon, Guilty Gear had Daisuke Ishiwatari, but if you ask Street Fighter fans to name one person who worked on their games, they'd probably just shrug. But Ono got up there. He talked about these games non-stop. He had genuine love for them, and it was infectious. He became the fighting game community's weird, jokey uncle who always brought his Blanca toys around. Everyone looked forward to that big sure you can cheer that he would give at every single EVO. He became a one-man promotion machine for Street Fighter. However, I said he was a controversial figure. And that's because during Street Fighter V's life, the Ono charm started to wear thin. People had tons of technical problems with this game. They had a lot of issues with the combat. And Ono never really addressed these. When he was asked about them, he would always give those business responses that didn't really say much, or he would just joke about it. But people didn't want jokes, they wanted answers. And speaking of wanting answers, people want communication from Capcom. But Ono would often go with the surprise approach, and hey, I get that. I get that everyone loves a big surprise reveal. But when people spend the last 6 months wondering if your game is still alive, yeah, that's not the best time to clam up. And I mentioned that Ono had this over-the-top wacky personality, and hey, throughout the life of Street Fighter 4, that was fine. People enjoyed seeing Ono come around and be this big, jokey, happy figure. But as I have pointed out, Street Fighter V took the goofy tone of this series and pushed it so much further than it had ever gone, and people were not feeling it. People were not happy with the super goofy tone of Street Fighter V, and when they needed someone to blame, they turned to the guy who was famous for having a super goofy personality. This behavior, Street Fighter V's sluggish attempt to recover, plus the disaster of Cross Tekken still being fresh in everyone's minds, made players start to think, you know, maybe Ono isn't the fighting game genius we all thought he was. Maybe he doesn't actually know what Capcom fighting games need, and if I see that Blanca figure one more time, I might just scream. And this feeling wasn't limited just to audiences. It became clear that a rift was forming between Ono and Capcom. The first sign of this was during Street Fighter Cross Tekken. Remember how in the last episode, I quoted several interviews where Ono said nobody helped him with Street Fighter 4, nobody wanted to make it, he said Capcom treated it like it was an unwanted child? And remember how I said during the fallout of Street Fighter Cross Tekken, Ono was so overworked, he actually collapsed and had to go to the hospital? Well, what I didn't tell you is that almost every single one of those quotes about how badly he was treated at Capcom came after he collapsed working on Cross Tekken. Before that, most of his interviews were far more positive. He said that other people did want to make Street Fighter and everyone was excited for it. Now, I decided to believe the way that Ono talked after his collapse because I did find interviews from other people who said that Ono was instrumental in bringing back Street Fighter and Inafune was indeed against it. So those interviews sounded more accurate to me. But the point is, Ono had now gone from that bright-eyed employee who wanted to please everyone to that guy who had been at the company for so long he was tired of everyone's crap. However, that frustration went both ways. There have been rumors circulating for years that Ono was not an easy guy to work with. There were stories about him being stubborn, shutting other people down in conversations. I even heard one story from someone about him getting a little too aggressive during a meeting. Again, I can't confirm any of these, so I don't want to report any of the specifics, but let's just say these stories were getting worse as time went on. So at this EVO, as his big announcement got leaked and he stood up there with a pro wrestler asking everyone to please be nice to him, yeah, I remember this being the exact moment that everyone looked at Ono differently. Ono, no matter how you felt about him, always got people hyped up at EVO, but as he stood up there, everyone just looked at him and thought, maybe it's time that you step down. But okay, leaks or not, there were still 3 brand new characters here, so that's something to be excited for. First up, E Honda, which did complete the original Street Fighter 2 lineup. E Honda is... yeah, he's E Honda alright. Doing E Honda things. Then there was Poison, and Poison is... yeah, she's Poison alright. Doing Poison things. She's now traded in her riding crop for a whip, so her moveset is kinda different. But the third character was brand new. To Street Fighter, that is. This was Lucia, a cop in Metro City who had previously appeared as a playable character in Final Fight 3 where she was sporting one of the most 90s outfits imaginable. Lucia's a fun character, she's cocky, she's got swagger to her, she's got a thick Brooklyn accent, and she's working with Mike Hagar who believes the Mad Gear gang is going to rise up again. As for how she fights, she uses a lot of kick attacks and is very combo focused, having to set up attacks that then immediately connect into different follow-ups. People mostly like Lucia, they thought she was a pretty good character, although after Abigail, you could kinda sense that a lot of players were thinking, okay, dude, oh no, we know you love Final Fight, but we're good on Final Fight. So as much as people like Lucia, and as much of a fan favorite as Poison was, having 2 Final Fight characters back to back, yeah, it's not what this game needed. As I said, at this time, a lot of people were thinking that Ono did not understand his audience, so him coming in here when the game was at its lowest and saying, okay, I need to do something big, something that's going to get everybody to come back. I know, more Final Fight characters. Yeah, it didn't help as much as he thought it would. This was maybe the worst possible time these 2 characters could have been revealed. But then, a few months later, the next DLC character was added. Gil. Yes, the big red and blue boss finally joined the game, and his story is all about linking this to the start of Street Fighter 3, as he announces his presence to the world, kicking off the chain of events in that game. Which he decides to do on G's YouTube channel? Interesting choice, although I guess it does give us more of an insight into G, and it makes him out to be even more of an ominous doomsday prophet. As for how he plays, he's actually pretty sick. You can choose between his fire and ice attacks for different effects, and his combo potential is pretty crazy. But that was nothing compared to the final character of Season 4, Seth. Seth has returned, although they've accidentally awakened in the wrong body thanks to Jury. Seth doesn't seem to take it very well, and they kinda go nuts. They begin hunting down anyone with psycho powers, thanking their bison. Seth has a V-skill that can steal moves from other characters, giving a bit of flashiness to this character that a lot of the other fighters were missing. And rather than their normal moves being taken from other Street Fighter characters like they were in the last game, now they're all references to other Capcom fighting games, like they've got Dimitri's Demon Cradle from Darkstalkers. And most surprising of all, a move from Dio from Capcom's JoJo's Bizarre Adventure fighting game, which I just realized means they took moves from 2 different vampires. That's a very weird coincidence. Seth was actually tons of fun, and along with Guild, the 2 of them got some of the highest praise of any characters in the game. And when I actually got my hands on them, I understood why. First off, I said that this was a game where you constantly had to ask, why doesn't this combo together? It felt like stuff should connect but doesn't. But Seth and Gil were characters who, when you said this should combo, it actually comboed. They felt very free, very smooth, very expressive. It felt like you could go in there and just start finding things even if you weren't an expert. But more importantly, I've danced around this throughout this entire video, but I didn't want to actually say it because, well, it's something that will vary greatly from player to player, and there's no scientific quantifiable way to measure it. But the game just didn't have a good feel to it. Hits didn't have a ton of impact to them. Punching the opponent with your basic moves felt so dull, and all the character animations just didn't have a lot of personality to them. But Seth, then Gil, and G had so much personality to their moves, and they had big impacts on their hits. Smacking an enemy around and then doing a Dio stance as you pummel them felt so cool. And this game, after 4 seasons, desperately needed moves that made you feel cool. And one other thing worth pointing out, when Gil was released, there was another huge update for the game. They had already given every character a second V trigger, but now every character had a second V skill, which again, gave the game more variety, and it helped make the older characters feel different, causing players to go back and start checking them out. Something was happening with this game. Characters were starting to feel different, better, stronger, faster, and the player base was feeling the same way. Again, going off the Steam charts numbers, I said that the player base for this game had dropped down to around the mid-thousands. But halfway through Season 4, those numbers were going up. They started hitting around 3,000, and unlike when Arcade Edition came out, these numbers didn't go back down after a few months. For a game on year 4 to suddenly jump up like this, it was surprising, encouraging, incredible. At this point, it's safe to say that casual audience was pretty much gone. You're not getting them back at year 4. But the more dedicated players out there, who had had so many problems with this game throughout its life, came back to check out some of these new characters, and then they started checking out the old characters. And they started saying, hey, that character that I was playing has gotten some decent buffs. And they addressed some of my problems with the balance in this game. And they're doing some cool things with the single player stuff, like those extra battles. They actually went and added Shadow Lady into the game from Marvel vs. Capcom. And she plays like she does in Marvel vs. Capcom. This is actually kind of cool now. This game was actually winning audiences back, and it wasn't doing it just by bringing in one spectacular new character that everyone was waiting for. They were doing it by just doing the hard work. Just getting in there and doing the nitty-gritty maintenance that this game needed. But with the release of Seth, that meant that Street Fighter V now had every single boss from the previous games in it, and that's how it planned to go out. In February the next year, 2020, Street Fighter V released Champion Edition, which included everything, and I do mean everything. Every single character, every single mode, every single costume. Yes, that's right, the #1 way that Capcom kept continuously updating and funding this game was now all included in one package. If there is anything that is going to signal the end of a live service, it's when they just give you everything. Meaning this game had finally reached its end. And now it was time for Capcom to begin development on Street Fighter 6. One problem though, they had already started development on Street Fighter 6, and it wasn't going well. Alright, we're now entering that point in time where behind the scenes development stories start to become rare. Not everything about the making of the next game has been revealed just yet, but there were some stories that got leaked. And normally I don't want to cover leaks because you can never tell if they're real or not. But these leaks about the development of Street Fighter 6 came from someone who had repeatedly leaked information from Capcom that turned out to be true. They had a really good record of revealing in-depth information about what was going on at Capcom. So this is one of those rare times where I actually do think the leaks are worth talking about. For starters, apparently the next game was supposed to come out in 2021, with Ono as the director. Previously, Ono had been producer, meaning he oversaw and guided the entire development, but now he would be the director, meaning he wouldn't be at the very top, but he would have a very hands-on role. He would still be crafting what went into the actual game. However, the game ended up having to be delayed because the early tests of it were all negatively received by the team at Capcom and by playtesters. And apparently this new game was going to be a team fighter, and there would be some new team mechanic that would be the entire focus of the game. It was all going to be built around this team mechanic. And apparently that team mechanic felt awful. Okay, first off, I enjoy team fighters, whether it be the one character at a time style KOF games or the tag style Marvel games. I love me a good team-based fighter. Street Fighter is not KOF or Marvel. Why are you turning this into a team fighter? Also, oh no, the last time that you tried to make a team-based fighter, it was Street Fighter Cross Tekken. You know, the game that was a massive financial flop and a lot of people complained about the team mechanics in it. What the hell are you thinking? This just sounded like desperation to me, like, oh, you guys complain about Street Fighter 4 being too defensive? Fine, I'll make Street Fighter 5 more focused on offense. Oh, you didn't like that one either? It's not crazy enough? Well, screw it, it's a team fighter now. I don't know what you people want, so I'm just going to throw anything I can at the wall and see what sticks. In fact, I mentioned earlier that Dragon Ball FighterZ became the first game in over a decade to beat Street Fighter at EVO. I would not be shocked if Yoshinori Ono looked at that and said, well, I guess that's what all the kids want now. That game got more people to play it than Street Fighter? Then we're going to make Street Fighter into Dragon Ball FighterZ. And more rumors and leaks were breaking every single month about problems between Ono and Capcom's higher-ups. And then in July 2020, a big crack appeared. During the midst of the global pandemic that was keeping everyone separated and delaying game production, multiple Japanese fighting game developers decided to band together to do a giant roundtable conference to show the world that they were still working, fighting games were still going strong, and they were all united. All the big names were there. Katsuhiro Harada to represent Tekken, Yasuyuki Oda to represent SNK, Daisuke Ishiwatari to represent Arc System Works. It was a veritable who's who of fighting game superstars. However, to represent Capcom, Yoshinori Ono wasn't there. Instead, Street Fighter was being represented by Street Fighter V's director, Takayuki Nakayama, and Shuhei Matsumoto, who joined Street Fighter V as a producer around Arcade Edition. So okay, these are definitely two important figures on the staff. They definitely did a lot of work on it. But we had spent the last decade seeing Ono as the face of Street Fighter, and now when the faces of all these fighting games were gathered together, he wasn't there. That's a little bit suspicious. But not nearly as suspicious as when Harada, known for joking around and poking fun at his fellow colleagues, started holding up pictures of other developers who weren't there that day. And everyone laughed, everyone was having fun with it. Until he held up a picture of Ono. And the two Capcom developers shut their mouths quick. Nakayama started to smile, he started to laugh at, but then he immediately went quiet, like he just realized, oh, right, I'm not supposed to talk about that. And again, this was at a point when everyone was wondering what Ono's future was. Everyone had heard the rumors. And the moment we saw their reaction at this joke, that is all anyone could talk about. No one remembers anything else from this conference. They only remember, oh right, that's when it got real awkward for the Capcom guys. And then, just 5 days after this roundtable discussion, something new and surprising happened. Nakayama and Matsumoto held a summer update show where they would lay out their plans for a 5th season of DLC. This was a big surprise because A, throughout all of Street Fighter V's life, we never got a Smash Bros. Style direct laying out their plans. Heck, multiple times Capcom would just go quiet out of nowhere. B, we were all positive there was no Season 5. We thought this game was done. And C, yeah, where's Ono? This now makes 2 big events in a row where he wasn't present. Well, a few days after this, we got our answer, as Yoshinori Ono announced that he would be leaving Capcom after working there for nearly 30 years. I don't think we really need to try and dissect why this happened. We've been covering it this entire time. The negative response to Street Fighter V and its slow recovery, multiple reports of being difficult to work with, and the early reports of Street Fighter VI being in bad shape. It wasn't one thing that got Ono out of Capcom, it was a long, slow series of events over the course of years. And unfortunately, it only had one possible conclusion. So, over the last 2 episodes, we've talked a lot about Ono's time at Capcom. I don't think much else needs to be said. But I'll just wrap up by saying, as someone who loves this franchise, as someone who grew up with it, I will forever appreciate Yoshinori Ono for bringing it back, because it simply would not have happened without him pushing so hard for it. And throughout these games, sure, I pointed out that people started to get tired of his overly goofy and jokey antics, but he was still an amazing force for hyping up the Street Fighter audience. But as time went on, I think it became clear to everyone, he was the person that needed to bring this franchise back, but he's not the one who should have kept overseeing it. He was a massive Street Fighter fan, there's no denying that. He loved these games, but he didn't really understand them. He didn't know what they needed. He didn't know what the audiences wanted. And hey, in all fairness, again, there were other people working on these games, and you can say that about them too. But he was the producer. This was his ship. It was up to him to manage this team, tell them the directions to go, tell the higher-ups what time and money the teams needed. And sadly, I just don't think he was the right choice for that job. But he did land on his feet. He was hired by and quickly rose to being president and CEO of Lasengil, the company behind the Fate Grand Order games, including the new Melty Blood game that came out a few years back. That's right, Ono brought back Street Fighter, then he helped to bring back Melty Blood. Say whatever you want about the guy, but most people never managed to get 1 revival under their belt. He managed to get 2. And I'll admit, I have no idea how old school Melty Blood fans feel about it. But speaking personally, I really dig that new Melty Blood. It's actually a ton of fun, with lots of content that kept getting added for free throughout its entire life. So you know what? I think Ono's gonna be just fine.
3, 2, 1. Guys, thank you very much, everyone. Please enjoy it.
But that brings us back to Street Fighter V, which, despite what we had all thought, was still going. The rumors of its demise have been greatly exaggerated. At this point, Capcom was still acting like this was business as usual. Hey guys, it's Street Fighter V! Of course it was always going to have 5 seasons. But no, later it would indeed be confirmed Street Fighter VI had to start all over again, so we needed to come up with another season to buy us time. And for many players, this was their first exposure to Nakayama and Matsumoto. It was our first chance to see their vision for this game and how they would handle things without Ono. And it turns out, their vision was pretty damn good. For starters, they introduced a brand new mechanic, another use for the V-trigger bar, where if you gave up 1 stock, you could do an Ultra Instinct style dodge and then counterattack. In all honesty, it's not that great. Your timing has to be very precise to avoid an attack, and we already had the V reversal, which was a good way of getting opponents off of you. However, it did look cool. And as I have said, Street Fighter V needed more flash. It needed more shiny, cool mechanics. So I do appreciate the attempt, and also, after all these years of only being able to use your V-gauge for V-reversal and V-trigger, it did feel nice to have another purpose for it. It did feel like that's something this game was missing. But the big deal this season were the new characters, and the first one to be revealed was Dan, and this was amazing. Why? Because Dan sucks. No, I don't mean in Street Fighter V he sucks. I mean he just sucks in general. Because that's literally the entire point of Dan Hibiki. He sucks. Why is that a good thing? Because Street Fighter V was so esports focused. It was a game all about getting you to watch and compete in the Capcom Cup and watch all the streams and replays and learning the meta so that way you can be a top tier competitor as well. But where was the heart? Where was the love? Where was the, fun? Where was the part of the game for everyone who didn't give a crap about being good? They just wanted to enjoy themselves. And suddenly, we got Dan Hibiki, the guy who will never be top tier. And you know something? Dan is fun as hell in this game. Not because he's good, he's fun because he's Dan. They took his classic taunts and now interpreted them into fun new ways, and his animations were extra wacky and full of personality. It was great! And with Dan's release, they threw in another character completely for free, 11. 11 was the prototype of 12, the robot that appeared in Street Fighter 3. But 11 isn't really a playable character, 11 is random select. When you select 11, they then transform into a random other character, except they've got the white 11 skin on top of them. And you might be saying, well, why did they go out of their way to make something special like this just for random select? Because it's fun. Random select in a fighting game, that's nothing special. Random select that gives characters special skins and actually has some kind of lore behind it? That's fun. And you know something? Having developers who are willing to go out of their way to put something into your game only because it's fun is great. And people thought so as well. Nobody out there was trying to main random select, but I saw multiple high-level players now saying, I'm going to main 11. I saw people holding 11 tournaments where everything was random select, simply because now random select had personality behind it. Oftentimes, what can make the difference between a fighting game being good or great are just those little tiny details. And this was a really good little tiny detail. Then next up was Rose. Okay, she's a classic, she's got her fans, but she now had some really unique mechanics. In fact, one of the biggest complaints with Street Fighter V's combat was that as important as the V-trigger was, it took way too long to activate. Guess what? Both Rose and Dan had moves that would increase the V-triggers, allowing you to just get to the fun part. Although there is one thing that I do have to bring up about Rose. There were a few fears raised by her story mode. She ends up fighting G, and he's going on about some great apocalyptic threat that's coming. Whatever G's purpose was, apparently he was a doomsday sayer of something big and catastrophic that was on the way, and it was too late to stop it now. And at the end of her story mode, Rose says the only way to stop this threat was to use her powers to send a message back in time to her younger self, all the way back to the Alpha games, essentially rebooting the entire series. And aside from the fact that this is exactly note for note what Raiden did in Mortal Kombat 9, like seriously, it is weird how much this resembles Mortal Kombat 9 storyline. But aside from that, Street Fighter fans spent years begging to finally move past Street Fighter 3. And now, Street Fighter V story mode ends exactly where Street Fighter 3 begins. We had no other choice now but to finally move past Street Fighter 3. And here comes Rose saying, you know what, we could just reboot the entire series. Now, thank God they did not end up doing that. But man, if I could ask Nakayama or Matsumoto one question, it would be, what was the deal with that? Did one of the higher-ups suggest rebooting the series so you had to put it in there so that way you could leave the door open? Was Ono just constantly throwing out ideas and rebooting the series was one of them, so this was like his final suggestion before he left? Were there so many ideas for Street Fighter 6 that at one point you were just going to say, screw it, let's just redo the whole thing? What was this about? But as I said, they didn't do this. Street Fighter 6 would move past Street Fighter 3, and so far to this day, G's whole message of apocalyptic doom has never come up again. Unless, I guess he could have been talking about Gil. You know what, screw it. Until they say otherwise, he was just talking about Gil, and that's all been resolved now. Next up, we got Oro returned from Street Fighter 3. He's no longer keeping one hand behind his back as he fights. Instead, he's keeping that hand preoccupied by carrying his pet turtle. Which, yes, is kind of goofy. But it's a charming type of goofy, so you know what? I'm cool with it. Honestly, I wasn't that excited for Oro. He was never a character that did for me. But gotta admit, testing him out for this video, yeah, he was pretty fun too. He's got a lot of the stuff that he had back in Third Strike, which is kind of what players have been asking for this whole time. And when he activates his V-trigger, he can juggle you into oblivion. And you know what? Rose's V-trigger was really good too. And so was Dan's. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the pro players found the V-triggers to be too strong. But the casual players didn't really find anything interesting in them. But now these characters had V-triggers that felt really interesting. They felt good no matter what level of skill you were at. Even the casual players saw these V-triggers and said, yeah, that's worth only being able to do that once per round for 5 seconds. But that's also because these characters felt good even when you weren't in V-trigger. These were characters who were now just fun at any moment in the match, which is kind of what you want from a fighting game character. But forget all that, because the fourth character this season would be a character from another Capcom series. Rival Schools! And hey, if you're new to this channel here and you don't know anything about me, I freaking love Rival Schools. It was the very first game that we ever covered for our fighting game retrospectives. And considering Sakura guest starred in Rival Schools, old school Capcom fighting game fans have been begging for years for Rival School characters to start making their way into Street Fighter. But every time that we asked for that, we were just told, best I can do is 3 more Final Fight characters, take it or leave it. Nothing against Final Fight, but we were good on Final Fight representation, and Rival Schools was long overdue. And now, we finally had 2 guys in charge of Street Fighter who wanted to show Rival Schools some love. And the craziest part is, they didn't include Batsu, which for the record, would have been fine. Batsu is awesome. But he's also the protagonist. He's the face of the series, so he's the safe pick. But they went with Akira Kazama, the cool pick. Akira was easily the most popular character in the series, but since she wasn't promoted that much, she's the kind of choice that only big fans would make. So this just told all of us Rival School fans that these 2 got it. They understood the fan base, they understood this game. But if you don't know anything about Akira, she was a shy girl whose brother went to a school full of punks and delinquents, but when he went missing, she suited up in a biker outfit and took on a badass persona to try and find him. And she had a V-skill where she could smack the opponent into the air and go flying up after them and start doing big combos, which looked great and felt better. But it's also the kind of thing that just felt like in an earlier version of this game, that would have been her V-trigger. That thing you have to spend half the match building up to so that way you get 1 air combo, don't screw it up. But now, she could just do it whenever she wanted. Her cool moves budget was actually really good. And for her actual V-trigger, she summoned in her brother to blow the opponent away with his sheer tough guy aura, which was the kind of flash and pizzazz this game needed. But that brought us to the final character, who was a brand new addition to this game, and he was... okay, this was Luke Sullivan. And we were told right from the start he would be a big face for the series moving forward, which made everyone realize, so he's going to be the star of Street Fighter 6. And turns out that was the case. And Luke's reception was... mixed. I mean, in all fairness, when you start a character off by telling everyone he's a big deal and you should all be treating him like he's a big deal, you already set expectations kinda high. But beyond that, people quickly started calling Luke Hoochie in reference to the Simpsons gag where a group of out-of-touch producers tried to create a cartoon character that would appeal to kids. And yeah, that kinda describes Luke. Everything about this design just screamed, make something kids will think is cool. Make something that feels like he's a new star. MMA is in, make him an MMA fighter, tattoo the Street Fighter 5 logo on him so that way everyone knows he's big and important, make sure he says lots of kids lingos so that way we know he's young and hip and fresh, give him the ugliest white guy dreads you've ever seen. Is that what they're going for with this? I still don't know what his hair is supposed to be. He looks like a mascot for string cheese. Well, here's the crazy thing about Luke's design. After Street Fighter 6 came out, Luke's voice actor, Alex Lee, said during a stream that everyone's assumptions were right. They made Luke for Street Fighter 6, but then when Street Fighter 5 got an extra season, they decided to sneak him into that game as a way to promote the new game. But since Street Fighter 5 was set years before Street Fighter 6, they de-aged Luke and tried to make him act more young and hot-headed. So in other words, they made a character who was designed to be hip and cool to appeal to the young players. Then they had to make him younger, hipper, and cooler for Street Fighter 5. And yeah, they might have turned the young, hip appeal to the kids demographic dial a little too far.
Attitude! Sunglasses!
Can we put him in more of a hip-hop context?
I think he needs a little more attitude.
Oh yeah, bingo. There it is, right there. That's it.
I love it.
Now, I'm going to hold off on talking about Luke's backstory for when we get to the game where he was actually supposed to be introduced. But as for his playstyle, he's a bit more straightforward than some of the other characters this season, and a whole lot stronger. Luke was insanely powerful, super aggressive, just pushed everyone's face in. They nerfed this guy multiple times, and he was still sitting at the top of everyone's tier list. Which did kind of screw up the meta, but it also got people excited for what we could see in Street Fighter 6. And so that brings us to the end of Street Fighter V's life. For real this time, it actually is the end. And in the end, was Street Fighter V a good game? Well, that's all subjective, obviously, and as I have pointed out multiple times, many people did really love this game. So in the end, all I can really do is speak personally. And in the end, listen, I've heard so many people say Street Fighter V became good. It was a story of redemption. It eventually overcame all its problems and became great. And listen, I started writing this script planning on saying that exact same thing. That was the big point I had in my mind when I was mapping all this out. And I will agree, this game by the end is really good. If you have never played this game, then yes, pick up Champion Edition, get that 5th season of DLC, which you can probably do just with fight money alone by going through each character's story mode. And yeah, you're gonna have a good time. That final product is actually good. But for this video, I went back through the entire history. I played every character, tried to learn each of them, sat through all their story modes, relived all the breaking news and reveals. And after going through all of that, I can't say that Street Fighter V as a whole multi-year-long experience was good. Don't get me wrong, I found some characters that were interesting. The balance changes did fix a lot, and when I finally got to Seth, I started to have fun. I found myself actually wanting to keep playing the game. And when I got to that final season, it was a huge leap in quality. But it was a long journey to get to that point. And up until the end of season 4, I just kept thinking, oh god, how much more do I need to record? I've heard so many people say that it's a good game because starting with this character, and I just keep thinking to myself, you are listing off a character that came in the 4th year of the game. That's not the biggest ringing endorsement. Like, I know a lot of people say, oh, well, the game really started to turn around when G arrived. G was the final character in Season 3, and if you guys remember, most people thought the rest of Season 3 was a huge letdown. Then Season 4 was pretty good, but Season 4 had one character come out and then 6 months of silence. That is not the way to run your live service. Even with all the positive things I can say about Season 4, it was still being managed horribly behind the scenes. As I said, if you start the game today with Champion Edition, it's great. But so many of us did not start with Champion Edition. We were there for the entire ride, and we had to spend so many years and so much money getting every single one of these pieces individually until after about 4 years, it became what it resembles today. Let me put it to you like this. If you have a cruise ship that leaves port with a huge hole in it, starts off already taking on water, and then everyone on board gets sick, then everyone gets attacked by pirates, then they get stuck in a canal, then the captain starts steering directly into an iceberg. If a new captain then shoves the old captain out of the way, sets the course right, and pulls back into port with a dozen survivors on board, Hey, I will congratulate that new captain. I will applaud them for saving as much as they could. But there is no way that I can look at that and call it a successful voyage. I don't think Street Fighter V is a tale of redemption. I think it's a tale of survival. It's the story of a game that managed to cross the finish line, but it ain't getting a medal. However, I asked, was Street Fighter V good? I didn't ask, was it a success? Because that is an entirely different question. And I'll answer that by saying probably my most controversial statement in this very controversial episode. Despite all its problems, I think that just like how Street Fighter 2 caused the fighting game boom, and just like how Street Fighter 4 re-energized the 2D fighting game genre, I will be willing to say that Street Fighter 5 also completely changed the face of the fighting game world. Although maybe not for the better this time, that's up for debate. Because Street Fighter 5 launched and completely missed its goal of 2 million sales by the end of its fiscal quarter. However, today, it's gone on to sell 7.5 million copies, making it one of the best-selling games in this series. Yes, you heard correct. This game, that many people called a failure, that many people badmouthed for years and years, went on to sell major numbers. But what made that happen? What was it that turned everything around? Well, it was nothing specific. Instead, it was kind of everything. This game not only kept pumping out content over and over and over again, but Capcom kept also talking about it. Every single time they had a press conference, they were shoving the Capcom Cup in everyone's face and telling you about how Street Fighter is the future of esports. And I mentioned much earlier in this video that the multiple updates over and over again did make a lot of players numb to this game, but it did also catch the attention of a lot of people who weren't playing the game. And it made them think, oh, you know what? Maybe I'll check this game out now. And I know you might be thinking, well, no player out there is just going to casually decide to pick up a $60 game. You're right. But thanks to all the seasons of DLC, they could discount this game immensely. Starting with Arcade Edition, every future version of this game would be sold at a budget price. And it would go on sale constantly. Like every other week, its already discount price was being slashed again. So even people who had heard bad stuff about this game found themselves thinking, wait, it's only $20 now? And after 3 years, there's how many characters in the game? Oh, that's actually kind of decent. That's a pretty good deal. And that's not even mentioning how much money they made off costumes. I joked about Chun-Li funding an entire season of characters just from her costumes. I wasn't joking that much. People pumped so much money into these costumes. You can blame Ono for the flop numbers at launch, but his plan to turn this into a live service with constant updates actually did pay off. And these days, live services are just the standard for fighting games. If you put out a fighting game today, you need to have seasons of DLC already lined up and ready to go. If you don't have DLC ready when you hit the ground, you will fade into obscurity overnight. Hell, Katsuhiro Harada made fun of Street Fighter for all their seasons of DLC and said that Tekken 7 would only have 2 seasons of DLC. Cut to that roundtable discussion we mentioned earlier where after dunking on Ono for several minutes, Harada then had to announce to the world that they had a season 4 of DLC on the way. Street Fighter V changed the face of fighting games because now you needed to be a live service. You needed to focus on esports. And if you don't believe me, after years of being gone, Sega announced that Virtua Fighter would be returning. And do you remember what the name of that new Virtua Fighter would be? Not Virtua Fighter Ultimate Showdown, no, that's its name in English. Its Japanese name is Virtua Fighter Esports. Letting everybody know this is what this industry is focused on now. And I know that someone out there is shouting out, because yes, before Street Fighter V, Killer Instinct leaned heavily into live service gaming, and its multiple seasons of characters was largely one of the reasons it succeeded. Heck, Killer Instinct ventured into that live service jungle deeper than anyone had ever gone before at that point. But I still attribute this live service era that we're living in more to Street Fighter than Killer Instinct for one simple reason. Killer Instinct ran into problems during development, but they managed to get it all ready in time and organized it perfectly. They weren't feeling good the night before the race, but when they showed up, they were ready to go. Street Fighter V showed up to that race, stumbling out in a bathrobe and struggling to get its sneakers on before the starter pistol went off. Then when the race began, Killer Instinct took off running, while Street Fighter fell flat on its face, and then rather than picking itself back up, proceeded to just start comically running with its head in the ground, kicking up dirt for the next 3 laps. So what's my point? My point is, imagine you're a game developer, and Killer Instinct comes up to you and says, "You should be a live service like us. We made our game free to play and organized everything for years ahead of time so that way it all ran smoothly, and we had a lot of content down the road, and we got great reviews and great word of mouth, and we had wonderful communication with our audience, and that pushed us ahead to victory." Then Street Fighter comes to you and says, "Hey, you should be a live service like us. We screwed up everything you could, put almost no content in the game, charged people $60 full price for that no content, and they still kept coming back and buying new characters and costumes for years, even as they were complaining about how much they didn't like the new characters and costumes." Yeah, if you're a video game developer, which of those two probably just convinced you to be a live service? So, Street Fighter V was over, and the long wait for Street Fighter 6 began. Although turns out, we didn't have to wait as long as we thought. Because in February 2021, Capcom put up a mysterious countdown timer. A countdown timer that was scheduled to line up with the end of the Capcom Pro Tour Japan Finals. And many players assumed this meant it was going to be Street Fighter 6. Aside from Resident Evil fans who assumed that was going to be a brand new Resident Evil announcement, despite the fact that they just got a Resident Evil game because Resident Evil fans are always hungry and will never be satisfied. But mostly everyone else assumed it was going to be something to do with Street Fighter 6. And that meant that this final game between Daigo and Kawano would be the last time that everyone was paying attention to Street Fighter V. And I bring that up because I cannot think of a more appropriate send-off for Street Fighter V than this match, which was a long game of footsies to slowly get in one hit here or there, until Kawano's Colleen landed a poke, confirmed it into V-trigger, which led to a combo, then Daigo made one wrong guess, leading into another combo, which resulted in a stun, which ended the game. And honestly, if you want a summation of what Street Fighter V's combat was, yeah, that was it. But then, when the game was over, Capcom gave players a taste of new things to come. A brand new journey was about to begin, and it would take us on a world tour that we would never forget.
Street Fighter 6.
Thank you all very much for tuning into the penultimate episode of the Street Fighter Retrospective. I cannot lie to you all, I didn't think I was going to talk this much about Street Fighter V, but the more I went into it, the more I realized how much there was to say about the combat and the live service format, and I forgot all the scandals. You should have heard the gasp I made when I suddenly remembered, oh right, the malware. They gave everyone malware. Yeah, this was a weird couple of years for Street Fighter. But if you want more from us, then make sure that you click that subscribe button. And if you enjoy what you're seeing here, make sure that you give us a thumbs up, leave us a comment, share these videos around the web. I really do appreciate everyone who does that. We put a lot of work into these episodes, as you can probably tell, so I do appreciate the people who spread them around. And if you want to find me around the web, I'll have my socials down there as well, but you can also find us on Patreon, where you can get early looks at upcoming videos, exclusive videos, or you can get your name in the credits like all these fine people you're seeing here. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. It really does mean a lot to me that you guys have been enjoying this series so much. So stay safe out there, and come back for the finale.